Hello, friend. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you settling in after a long day? Perhaps you're watching the darkness gather outside your window, or maybe dawn is just breaking where you are. Wherever you find yourself, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to do something different. We're going to trace the entire arc of Japanese mythology, from the first stirrings of Kreon in primordial chaos to the gods and shruttas that still whisper through Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples today. This isn't just a collection of old stories. This is the narrative DNA of an entire civilization, the dreamscape that shaped how millions of people understood the world, their place in it, and the invisible forces that moved through every tree, every stone, every gust of wind. Picture this. You're standing on the rugged coastline of ancient Japan, perhaps on one of the smaller islands that dot the inland sea. The year is impossible to determine because we're before recorded history, in that liminal space where myth and memory blur together. The air smells of salt and pine. Waves crash against volcanic rocks worn smooth by centuries of Pacific tides. Behind you, mountains rise steeply, their peaks often lost in mist. This is a land of dramatic contrasts, serene beauty punctuated by earthquakes, typhoons, and volcanic eruptions. A land where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was never quite solid. The people who first told these stories lived in a world of constant negotiation with forces beyond their control. They watched the sun rise over the ocean each morning and wondered what divine drama made it possible. They felt the earth shake beneath their feet and imagined the thrashing of a great catfish in the underworld. When lightning split the sky, they heard the anger of storm gods. When rice grew abundantly, they gave thanks to spirits of fertility and harvest. Every aspect of existence had a face, a name, a personality. But here's what makes Japanese mythology so endlessly fascinating. It never fossilized into a single unchanging canon. Unlike some mythological traditions that were eventually codified and frozen in sacred texts, Japanese mythology remained fluid, absorbing influences from Korea, China, and later Buddhism, while still maintaining its distinct character. It's a mythology that grew and changed with the people who told it, adapting to new circumstances while preserving ancient truths. At the heart of these stories lies a fundamental question that every culture must answer. How did we get here? Not just as individual people, but as a nation, as inhabitants of these particular islands, as descendants of particular gods. The Japanese answer to this question is breathtakingly elaborate. A cosmology that begins with primordial deities emerging from chaos and culminates in the divine descent of the Imperial line itself. These myths served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, certainly. Stories told around hearthfires on winter nights, dramatic performances at festivals, sacred narratives chanted by priests. But they were also political tools, religious doctrine, moral instruction, and historical record all woven together. They explained why certain families held power, why certain mountains were sacred, why certain taboos must be observed. They created a shared identity for people spread across hundreds of islands, speaking different dialects, living vastly different lives. What we're about to explore together isn't just ancient history. These stories still matter. Walk through any Japanese city today and you'll find small shrines tucked between office buildings, torii gates, marking the threshold between mundane and sacred space. The kami, the gods and spirits we'll meet in these stories, are still honored, still consulted, still believed by millions to inhabit the natural world. The wedding ceremonies, coming-of-age rituals and New Year celebrations that mark the rhythm of modern Japanese life all echo back to these ancient myths. So why does this story matter for you, wherever you are in the world? Because mythology is how humans have always made sense of the fundamental mysteries: creation and destruction, order and chaos, life and death, power and justice. The Japanese approach to these questions is uniquely their own, yet it touches on universal truths. In their stories of gods who make mistakes, who feel jealousy and love and grief, who create beauty and cause devastation, we find reflections of our own struggles to understand existence. Over the next several hours, we're going to trace this entire tradition from its cosmic beginnings to its enduring legacy. We'll meet the primordial deities who stirred the ocean with a jeweled spear. We'll witness the birth of the sun goddess and the chaos caused by her tempestuous brother. We'll descend to the land of the dead and face its terrible queen. We'll follow heroes on impossible quests and watch as the divine realm gradually merges with the human world. We'll see how Buddhism arrived and transformed everything, how these myths were collected and codified, and how they've been interpreted and reinterpreted across centuries. This is a long journey we're beginning, but I promise you, every part of it matters. These aren't just quaint old tales, they're a window into how an entire culture constructed meaning, how they explained suffering and celebrated joy, how they imagined the sacred dimension of reality that exists alongside and interpenetrates our ordinary world. The night is long, but we have time. Pour yourself something warm, get comfortable, let the outside world fade for a while. Now, let's begin. In the beginning, though beginning is perhaps the wrong word for something that had no clear start, there was chaos. Not the violent, destructive chaos we might imagine, but something more profound and strange. An undifferentiated ocean of potential. Neither matter nor void, neither light nor dark. The ancient texts call it Amaterasu, the space between heaven and earth before heaven and earth existed to have space between them. From this primordial state, something stirred. The first kami emerged not through creation, but through spontaneous manifestation, appearing as naturally as steam rises from water. Their names are abstract, difficult even for native speakers to parse. Amis no Minakanushi no Kami, the deity master of the august center of heaven. Then Takami Musubi no Kami and Kami Musubi no Kami, the high august producing deity and the divine producing deity. These beings had no form, no gender, no stories attached to them. They simply were, principles of existence given names, the first conscious witnesses to reality beginning to organize itself. More deities followed in successive generations, each slightly more defined than the last. The accounts in the Kojiki, Japan's oldest surviving chronicle completed in 712 CE, and the Nihon Shoki, compiled in 720 CE, differ slightly in their lists and orders, but both agree on the essential progression. Consciousness emerged from unconsciousness, definition from undifferentiation, form from formlessness. These were the first gods with clear gender, the first divine couple, the first beings capable of creating through relationship rather than spontaneous manifestation. Picture them standing on the floating bridge of heaven, Ame no Ukihashi, looking down at the chaotic brine below. Unlike the shapeless deities who preceded them, Izanagi and Izanami had form, personality, will. They were given a task by the elder gods, to solidify and complete the forming world below. The tool they received was the Ame no Nuboko, the heavenly jeweled spear, encrusted with precious gems, heavy with divine purpose. Izanagi thrust the spear down into the churning ocean and stirred. When he withdrew it, brine dripped from the tip. These drops solidified as they fell, piling up until they formed the first land, Onogoro-jima, the self-forming island. This wasn't metaphor to the ancient Japanese. This was literal history, the origin story of their archipelago, explaining how solid earth emerged from the surrounding sea. The two deities descended to this new land, and what happened next is one of mythology's most fascinating moments, a creation story that begins with an awkward mistake. Seeing each other in their full forms for the first time on solid ground, Izanagi and Izanami decided to perform a marriage ritual. They erected a sacred pillar at the island's center and agreed to walk around it in opposite directions. They attempted to create together, and Izanami gave birth, but the child was malformed, a leech-like thing they called Hiruko. Devastated, they placed it in a reed boat and set it adrift. Their next offspring was equally disappointing, an island of foam that dissolved quickly. Something had gone wrong. The couple consulted the elder deities, who identified the problem immediately. Izanami had spoken first during the marriage ritual. In a patriarchal cosmology, this reversal of proper order had cosmic consequences. The ritual must be performed again, correctly this time. They walked around the sacred pillar once more. This time Izanagi spoke first, and this time creation succeeded. What followed was an explosion of fertility. Izanami gave birth to the islands of Japan itself, first Awaji, then Shikoku, Oki, Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and finally Honshu, the main island. 8 islands in total, which is why Japan was called Oyashima, the 8 Great Islands, even though the actual archipelago contains thousands of smaller landmasses. But they didn't stop with geography. Izanami continued giving birth, now producing kami, gods and spirits of specific natural phenomena. She birthed the god of wind, who immediately blew away the morning mist that had obscured the islands. She birthed the god of trees, and forests sprang up across the mountainsides. the god of mountains, the god of plains, the god of waterfalls, the god of fog, the god of valleys. Each deity took up residence in its appropriate domain, and the world became increasingly defined, increasingly present. The sea god was born, and with him came the rhythms of tide and current. The food goddess emerged, and agriculture became possible. Gods of metal, pottery, fire, and all useful things came into being through Izanami's continued labour. The world was being furnished with both its physical features and the invisible forces that would govern its functioning. But this abundance of creation was building toward tragedy. During the birth of Kagutsuchi, the god of fire, Izanami was horribly burned. The heat was too great, the flames too intense. She fell ill, her divine body unable to heal from such wounds. As she lay dying, her suffering produced yet more deities, gods born from her vomit, her urine, her feces, her final agonies. Even in death, she couldn't stop creating. Izanagi was beside himself with grief. The god who had stirred the ocean and created islands, who had fathered dozens of deities, was powerless to save his beloved wife. In his rage and sorrow, he drew his sword, the 10-span blade called Totsuka no Tsurugi, and killed Kagutsuchi, the fire god whose birth had killed Izanami. The blood that dripped from the sword created even more deities, gods of thunder and martial fury. The corpse of the fire god, when dismembered, produced volcanic kami that still dwell in the mountains. Izanami died and descended to Yomi no Kuni, the land of darkness, the underworld from which no one returns. Izanagi was left alone in the upper world, surrounded by the abundant creation they had made together, now emptied of meaning by her absence. This is where our story turns from pure creation myth into something more psychologically complex, into a meditation on loss, boundaries, and the terrible consequences of trying to reverse the irreversible. The foundations had been laid, the world existed, but the price of creation had been paid in divine blood and suffering, and the relationship between life and death, upper world and underworld, had been irrevocably established. The stage was set for what would come next, Izanagi's doomed journey to retrieve his wife from death, and the birth of the most important gods in the entire Japanese pantheon from the rituals of purification that would follow his failure. Izanagi couldn't accept it. The grief was too enormous, the absence too absolute. His wife had descended to Yomi, but death was still new to the world. Perhaps its rules weren't yet fixed. Perhaps there was a way to bring her back. The thought consumed him until he made a decision that would reshape the cosmos. He would follow her into the underworld and negotiate her return. The entrance to Yomi was a cave. Accounts vary on its exact location, but many traditions place it in the Izumo region, in what is now Shimina Prefecture. Imagine that descent, leaving behind the bright world of creation, still fresh and new, entering a passage through solid rock that grew progressively darker, colder, damper. The smell of earth and decay, no light except what he carried with him. When Izanagi finally reached the underworld proper, he called out for Izanami. Her voice came from the darkness, tender but strained. She was so happy he had come, she said, but there was a problem. She had already eaten the food of Yomi. This detail matters profoundly. Cross mythologies, consuming the food of the dead binds you to the realm of death. Izanami was no longer entirely free to leave. Still, she wanted to try. She would petition the gods of Yomi for permission to return. But Izanagi must promise one thing absolutely. He must not look at her while she was making these arrangements. He must wait in darkness and not use any light to see her current form. Under no circumstances should he look upon her. This prohibition echoes through mythology worldwide. Orpheus and Eurydice, Lot's wife, Psyche and Eros, the forbidden look, the test of trust that inevitably fails. We tell these stories again and again because they capture something true about human nature. We cannot resist. Curiosity, doubt, desperate need, something always makes us look. Izanagi waited in the dark. Hours passed, or days. Time has no meaning in Yomi. Izanami did not return from her consultations with the death gods. Finally, Izanagi's patience broke. He took the comb from his hair, the left side of his head ornament, broke off one of its teeth and lit it as a torch. He would look for just a moment, just to see if she was coming back. What he saw broke him. Izanami's body had already begun decomposing. Maggots crawled across her flesh. 8 thunder deities had been born from her putrefaction and now clung to different parts of her corpse. This wasn't the beautiful goddess who had birthed islands and gods. This was death itself, corruption, the horror of the body's betrayal. The ancient texts are specific about the details, unflinching in their description of decay. Izanagi screamed and ran. Behind him, Izanami's voice changed. The tenderness vanished, replaced by rage and humiliation. She shrieked. How dare he look upon her in this state, after she had specifically forbidden it? She summoned the Shikome, the hags of Yomi, foul spirits who delighted in death and decay, and sent them chasing after Izanagi. What followed was a desperate flight through the underworld. Izanagi threw his headdress behind him, and it transformed into grapes. While the hag stopped to devour them, he gained distance. When they resumed pursuit, he threw his comb, which became bamboo shoots. Again they stopped to eat, and again he ran, but Izanami wasn't finished. She sent the 8 thunder gods born from her decomposition. She sent a horde of 1,500 warriors of Yomi. Finally, unable to bear the shame and rage, she began chasing him herself, this rotting goddess who had once been his beloved wife, now transformed into the terrible queen of the dead, leading an army of horrors through the dark passages toward the world of the living. Izanagi reached the border just ahead of them. At the boundary between Yomi and the upper world, he found 3 peaches growing. Why peaches existed in this liminal space, the myths don't explain. Perhaps they were the last remnant of life before death's domain. Perhaps they were always there as a kind of final defense. Izanagi picked the peaches and hurled them at his pursuers. The fruit of life drove back the forces of death. This gave him just enough time to reach the entrance, the cave mouth where light still touched stone. He found an enormous boulder, so massive it would take 1,000 men to move it, and with divine strength born of terror, he pushed it across the opening, sealing Yomi off from the world of the living. On the other side of that rock he heard Izanami's voice, no longer the woman he had loved, now fully transformed into the ruler of death. This exchange became the fundamental explanation for mortality in Japanese mythology. Death entered the world not through sin or punishment, but through a broken relationship, a violated trust, a goddess's shame and rage. And life's response wasn't to eliminate death, but to exceed it, to ensure that birth always outpaced dying, that life remained more abundant than death's harvest. But the cost to Izanagi was profound. He had been contaminated by contact with death and decay, made impure by his time in Yomi. The concept of kigare, pollution or defilement, became central to Shinto practice from this moment forward. Death was the ultimate source of impurity, and anyone who touched it, even a god, required purification. Izanagi descended to a river, the Woto River in some accounts, others say the Tachibana River in Kyushu. He removed his clothes and possessions, each item generating new deities as it fell, gods of roads, borders, difficult passages. Then he entered the water and began the first purification ritual, the prototype for the Mythology that Shinto practitioners would perform for thousands of years afterward. As he washed, creation exploded again. The dirt from his body as he bathed in the upper river produced malevolent kami. The middle portion of the river produced deities that corrected those evils. Each part of his divine body generated specific gods as he cleaned it. Gods of straits and harbour mouths, gods of the ocean's surface and depths. Finally, he washed his face. And from this simple act of purification, the 3 most important deities in Japanese mythology were born. From his left eye came Amaterasu Omikami, the sun goddess, radiant and glorious, destined to rule the celestial plane. From his right eye came Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, the moon god who would govern the night. And from his nose, which seems humble until you remember that breath and spirit are linguistically and conceptually linked in Japanese as in many languages, came Susanoo no Mikoto, the storm god, tempestuous and wild, who would cause more trouble than perhaps any other deity in the pantheon. Izanagi rejoiced. After all the tragedy, after the descent into death and the loss of his wife, here was unexpected grace. 3 noble children, perfect and powerful, born from his very essence. He divided reality among them. Amaterasu would rule the high celestial plane, Tsukuyomi would govern the night and its mysteries, and Susanoo would command the ocean. This distribution established the fundamental structure of the cosmos. The world was no longer just the islands floating in the sea. Now there were distinct realms, heaven and earth, an ocean, light and darkness, order and chaos. Gods had specific domains, specific responsibilities. The age of pure, undifferentiated creation was over. The age of organization, of divine governance, of complex relationships between different spheres of reality had begun, but this new order was fragile. Susanoo, the storm god, wouldn't accept his assigned realm. While Amaterasu took to her duties with grace and Tsukuyomi faded into the quiet mystery of the moon, Susanoo wept and raged. He wanted to see his mother Izanami, he said, even though she was trapped in Yomi, transformed into the queen of the dead. His tantrum was divine in scale. His weeping dried up rivers and withered mountains. His rage caused earthquakes. Izanagi, exhausted by everything he'd endured, finally banished Susanoo, telling him to leave the high celestial plane entirely. But before leaving, Susanoo decided to visit his sister Amaterasu to bid her farewell. This decision would trigger the next great crisis in heaven, a confrontation between sun and storm that would plunge the world into darkness and require the combined cleverness of 800 gods to resolve. The early structures were in place now, a three-tiered cosmos with the high celestial plane, the middle world of land and sea, and Yomi beneath, a boundary between life and death, sealed but permeable in ways that would become important, and a divine family whose relationships would mirror and establish patterns for human society, cooperation and conflict, order and chaos, the tensions that drive all narrative and all history forward. When Susanoo approached the high celestial plane to bid farewell to his sister Amaterasu, the very mountains and rivers trembled. This wasn't a gentle visit. The storm god's nature was violent, excessive, uncontained. He couldn't move without causing disturbance. Amaterasu saw him coming and assumed the worst. Why would her tempestuous brother seek her out if not to challenge her authority, to claim her realm for himself? She armed herself, braided her hair in masculine style, strapped on armor, took up her bow and quiver of 1,000 arrows and 500 arrows more. When Susanoo finally arrived, he found the sun goddess in a warrior's stance, ready for battle, the ground around her churned by her stamping feet. She demanded. Susanoo explained he had been banished by their father and wanted only to say goodbye before descending to the land of the dead to be with his mother. No ulterior motives, no schemes, but Amaterasu didn't believe him. She demanded proof of his sincerity. What followed was one of the strangest contests in any mythology, a challenge to prove pure intentions through a ritual of divine procreation. They would each create children from objects belonging to the other. The gender and quality of these offspring would reveal the truth of Susanoo's heart. Amaterasu took her brother's 10-span sword, broke it into 3 pieces, chewed them in her mouth, and spat out a fine mist. From that mist emerged 3 goddesses, elegant, gentle beings. Susanoo then took the 5 strands of jewels from his sister's hair and arms, chewed them similarly, and exhaled 5 male gods, strong and noble. Susanoo immediately claimed victory. The males came from your possessions, he argued, so they're really your children. The females came from my sword, so they're mine. It was twisted logic, typical of his cunning nature, but Amaterasu accepted it. Susanoo had proven himself, or so it seemed. He was allowed to stay temporarily in the high celestial plane while preparing for his descent to the netherworld. But here's where Susanoo's true nature emerged. Victory went to his head. He became reckless, destructive, increasingly outrageous in his behavior. What started as boisterous celebration escalated into divine vandalism. First, he destroyed the boundaries between rice fields that Amaterasu had carefully established. Not just moved them, obliterated them, mixing the divine paddies together in chaotic confusion. When the autumn harvest came, he defecated in the hall where the first fruit ceremony was being held, contaminating the sacred ritual with excrement. He skinned a piebald colt backward, a grotesque violation of proper order, and threw its flayed corpse through the roof of the sacred weaving hall, where Amaterasu and her attendants were making divine garments. That last act had terrible consequences. One of Amaterasu's weaving maidens was so startled by the bloody carcass crashing through the ceiling that she jabbed herself with her shuttle and died from the wound. Others say the maiden struck her genitals with the shuttle in shock. Either way, the violence Susanoo introduced into the celestial realm resulted in death, the first death in heaven. Amaterasu had endured enough. Her brother's behavior wasn't just offensive, it was pollution of the highest order. He had brought Kagara, defilement into the very center of divine purity. In her grief and anger and disgust, the sun goddess made a choice that would have cosmic repercussions. She withdrew. She retreated to the Amino-Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, and sealed herself inside. And when the sun goddess hid herself, the entire world, both heaven and earth, plunged into absolute darkness. This wasn't night time. This was the absence of the sun itself. Imagine the terror below. Farmers in their fields suddenly blind, children crying out for mothers they couldn't see, the temperature dropping, chaos spreading as all light vanished from existence. In heaven, the 800 myriad gods, Yayorozu no Kami, the countless deities gathered in confusion and fear. Roosters crowed desperately, trying to summon a dawn that wouldn't come. Evil spirits emerged from their hiding places, thriving in the darkness, causing mischief and harm. The gods convened an emergency council along the Yasugawa, the river of heaven. This moment marks the first true example of divine governance in Japanese mythology. Not a single creator god decreeing from on high, but a collective of deities debating, scheming, working together to solve a crisis. Two gods took the lead. Omoi Kane no Kami, the god of wisdom and thought, devised the strategy. Ame no Koyane no Mikoto, the ancestral deity of the Nakatomi clan who would become the hereditary priests of Japan, took charge of ritual matters. Together they orchestrated an elaborate plan that relied not on force, but on curiosity and cleverness. They gathered sacred objects, a mirror made by the smith god Amaterasu polished to perfect reflectiveness, a string of 500 jewels called Yasaka ni no Magatama, a sacred sakaki tree, dug up roots and all, decorated with offerings, the jewels on the upper branches, the mirror in the middle, white and blue cloth offerings below. They brought Ama no Uzume no Mikoto, the goddess of dawn and revelry whose role would prove crucial. Outside the cave they arranged everything carefully. Constant crowing roosters were gathered to herald the hoped-for dawn. Strong gods positioned themselves near the entrance, Ame no Tajikarao, the god of physical strength ready to act when the moment came. Then Uzume began her performance. She overturned a wooden tub to use as a stage and began dancing. Not a refined, dignified dance, but something wild and obscene. She became possessed by divine frenzy, stamped her feet so hard the heavens shook, exposed her breasts, pushed her skirt down past her genitals. The assembled gods roared with laughter. 800 deities cracking up, the sound of their mirth echoing through the darkness. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard the commotion. Curiosity got the better of her anger. If the world was supposed to be in darkness and chaos with her gone, why was there laughter? Why did it sound like the gods were having a festival? She cracked the cave door open just slightly. Amaterasu's curiosity intensified. More magnificent than her? Impossible. She opened the door a bit wider to see this alleged superior goddess. And there, positioned perfectly, was the mirror. The first thing Amaterasu saw when she peeked out was her own radiant reflection. She'd never seen herself before. There had never been a reflective surface brilliant enough to catch her light. She was transfixed, drawn forward to see this mysterious glowing being. The moment she stepped further from the cave, Tajikarao seized the door and pulled it fully open. Another god stretched a sacred rope, Shimenawa, across the entrance, preventing her from retreating back inside. "You cannot return to the caves," they declared. Light flooded back into the world. The crisis was over, but the matter of Susanoo remained. The gods held a formal tribunal, another example of collective divine governance. Susanoo was found guilty of grievous offences against divine order. His punishment was severe. He would have his beard cut off, his fingernails and toenails removed, and would be forced to pay a massive fine before being permanently exiled from the high celestial plane. This wasn't merely punitive. Cutting hair and nails had deep significance in ancient Japanese culture. These parts of the body were believed to contain spiritual power. Removing them symbolically neutered Susanoo's divine authority. The fine represented restitution for the cosmic damage he'd caused, and exile ensured he could never again threaten the celestial order Amaterasu represented. The sun goddess returned to her duties, now with renewed recognition of her importance. The mirror that had drawn her from the cave became one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan, objects whose possession legitimized imperial rule. The jewels Susanoo had spat out during their contest became another. The sword he would later obtain through heroic deeds would become the third. These objects formed the material link between divine and earthly authority. What this entire episode established was something crucial. Even in heaven, power required structures, boundaries, consequences. Pure divine force, like Susanoo's storm nature, couldn't be allowed to run wild without destroying the order necessary for existence to flourish. Amaterasu represented sovereignty, yes, but also stability, predictability. The conditions under which agriculture, civilization, and culture could develop. The lesson extended to the earthly realm below. Just as Amaterasu governed the celestial plane with measured wisdom, just as the 800 gods convened in council to solve collective problems, human rulers would be expected to govern through a combination of divine mandate and practical wisdom. The Imperial line would trace itself back to Amaterasu directly, claiming its right to rule through this vertical connection to heaven. But consolidation of divine power above didn't mean peace. It meant the conflicts would shift, downward to the central land of reed plains, the middle world where humans were beginning to develop, and outward to the wild places where old gods still held sway before the celestial order reached them. Susanoo's exile would lead him on a path of transformation, from destructive troublemaker to legitimate hero. His encounter with a family terrorized by an 8-headed serpent would prove that even chaos, properly directed, could serve creation. But that's a story for our next section, as we move from the establishment of celestial governance to the pacification and ordering of the earthly realm itself. Susanoo descended from heaven a diminished god. His hair and nails had been removed, his divine authority stripped, his welcome in the high celestial plane permanently revoked. He fell to earth, literally fell, perhaps like a meteor or a thunderbolt somewhere in the mountainous Izumo region on the western edge of Honshu, the main island. He found himself in a world still wild, still largely unshaped by the divine intention, where local kami ruled their domains with ancient prerogatives and paid no homage to the new celestial order above. He wandered the mountains until he came to a river, the High River, in what is now Shimen Prefecture. The water ran strange, clouded with something that made him curious. He followed it upstream. Floating in the current were broken chopsticks, suggesting humans lived above. This intrigued him. The Earth realm was still young, encounters with humans were rare and significant. He climbed higher and eventually heard weeping. In a clearing he found an elderly couple and a young woman, all three crying as if the world was ending. The girl between them was their daughter Kushina Dehime, wondrous innate a princess, and she was extraordinarily beautiful. Susanoo asked why they wept. The old man's story was terrible. We had 8 daughters once, but every year a monster comes, Yamato no Orochi, the 8-forked serpent. It devours one of our daughters, 7 are gone. Only Kushina Dehime remains, and the time has come again. Susanoo asked them to describe this creature. What they described was almost beyond comprehension. The serpent had 8 heads and 8 tails, each moving independently. Its body was so enormous it stretched across 8 valleys and 8 hills simultaneously. Its back was covered with moss and ancient cedars, trees growing from the creature's scales because it had lived so long. Its eyes were like red winter cherries, burning with malevolence. Its belly was always bleeding, perpetually inflamed and raw. "I can defeat this creature," Susanoo said. The old man looked at this bedraggled stranger who claimed divine lineage, no longer radiant, his hair unevenly shorn, his hands bearing the marks of recent punishment. But what choice did they have? They agreed. Susanoo immediately transformed Kushina Dehime into a comb and tucked her into his hair for safekeeping, both protecting her and keeping her close to witness what would happen next. Then he instructed the old couple carefully: brew 8 vats of extremely strong sake, the most potent rice wine they could make. Build a fence with 8 gates, and place 1 vat behind each gate. They did exactly as instructed. When everything was prepared, Susanoo waited. He didn't pace or rehearse heroic poses. He simply sat still, the patience of a predator, of someone who understood that the moment of violence would come soon enough, and there was no point in wasting energy anticipating it. The serpent arrived as predicted. The ground shook with its movement. Imagine the sound, the earth-trembling bass note of something that massive, displacing air and stone. Through the trees, Susanoo caught glimpses, a head here, a tail there, the creature's bulk so enormous it seemed to approach from multiple directions simultaneously. Then it emerged fully into the clearing, and even Susanoo, who had seen the birth of islands and the depths of Yomi, felt a moment of awe at its terrible magnificence. The Orochi's 8 heads swiveled independently, serpentine necks thick as tree trunks, each mouth large enough to swallow a horse. It sniffed the air and caught the overwhelming scent of sake. All 8 heads turned toward the 8 gates, drawn by the smell of alcohol. Ancient, powerful, and apparently quite fond of drink, the serpent thrust one head through each gate and began lapping up the sake. The vats were deep and the sake potent. Each head drank and drank, competitive in their consumption. Gradually the creature's movements became less coordinated. The heads started swaying. The eyes, burning red like winter cherries, began to glaze. One by one the massive heads drooped. The serpent, thoroughly drunk, collapsed in 8 directions simultaneously, its consciousness scattered across 8 intoxicated brains. This was the moment. Susanoo drew his sword, the 10-span blade called Worochi no Aramasa, rough blade of Orochi, and began his work. This wasn't a clean heroic kill, one perfect stroke. This was butchery, methodical and thorough. He hacked the creature apart systematically, section by section, head by head, tail by tail. The blood that flowed from the Orochi turned the High River red. The name itself, High River, became associated with high, the word for blood, though scholars note this is likely folk etymology. When Susanoo reached the 4th tail, his blade struck something hard, damaging the sword. He cut more carefully around the obstruction and discovered, embedded in the serpent's flesh, an extraordinary weapon. A sword of perfect manufacture, untarnished despite being enclosed in monster flesh for who knows how long. The blade seemed to generate its own clouds of mist. He named it Aemon no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds, though it would later become known as Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, after another hero used it to cut through a grass fire set by enemies. This blade, pulled from a monster's tail in the wild mountains of Izumo, would become one of the 3 Imperial regalia, the divine objects legitimizing Imperial rule. But Susanoo didn't keep it for himself. Despite his recent expulsion from heaven, despite everything that had happened, he sent the sword to his sister Amaterasu as a peace offering. This gesture is remarkably telling about Susanoo's character. He was chaos, yes, but not evil. He was skilled, excessive, destructive of rigid boundaries, but capable of heroism, capable of deference to proper authority when he chose. Amaterasu accepted the gift, and with it a reconciliation of sorts. Susanoo, the rejected, banished storm god, had inadvertently furthered the celestial order by defeating a primordial chaos monster and claiming its power for heaven. The sword in Amaterasu's possession strengthened her claim to sovereignty over all the realms. With the serpent dead and the sword sent skyward, Susanoo turned to his bride. He released Kushinada Hime from her comb form and built a palace for them in Izumo, at a place called Shuga. This is considered the first waka poem in Japanese literature, the origin of a poetic tradition that would flourish for millennia. That a poem about building fences, about establishing boundaries, creating protected space, came from Susanoo, of all gods, says something profound about transformation. The deity who had destroyed boundaries in heaven now created them on earth. Marriage and home building civilized even the storm god. Susanoo and Kushinada Hime's descendants would become the Izumo Taisha lineage, the great shrine families of Izumo. Their son was Yashima Jinumi no Kami, and his son in turn was Okune Nushi no Kamiyo, who would become one of the most important deities in the entire pantheon, the great landmaster, the pacifier and the organizer of the central land of Reed Plains. Okune Nushi's story begins with persecution. He had 80 older brothers, the Yasogami, some collectively, who all desired to marry the beautiful princess Yakamihime of Inaba. They made a pilgrimage together to seek her hand, and Okune Nushi was forced to accompany them as a bag carrier, treated as a servant despite being of divine lineage. The rabbit had been skinned alive by some earlier cruelty, its flesh exposed and burning, lying by the roadside in agony. The rabbit, desperate, followed their instructions. The salt water burned its wounds terribly, and when the wind dried the salt water, the rabbit's skin became so tight and painful it could barely move. Okune Nushi, coming behind as bag carrier, found the rabbit in even worse condition. Taking pity, he asked what had happened. The rabbit explained. It had lived on the island of Oki and wanted to cross to the mainland. It had tricked a family of crocodiles, or sharks, wani can mean either, into forming a bridge by claiming to count them. As the rabbit hopped from creature to creature, Counting aloud, the final crocodile realized the deception and skinned the rabbit in revenge. Okunanushi instructed the rabbit gently, "Go to the river mouth where fresh water meets the sea. Wash in that brackish water, then gather the fluffy pollen from the cattails growing there and roll in it." The rabbit did exactly as told, and its fur grew back soft and white. In gratitude, it prophesied, "Your 80 brothers will not win Yakamihime." The prophecy proved true. Yakamihime chose Okunanushi specifically because of his compassion, but this enraged the 80 brothers, who repeatedly tried to kill him. Twice they murdered him successfully, and twice his divine mother petitioned the Kami Musubi, the god of producing life, who sent goddesses to resurrect him. The second time, his mother told him to flee to the land of his ancestor Susanoo, where he might find protection or wisdom. What followed was a series of trials orchestrated by Susanoo himself, testing whether Okunanushi was worthy of inheriting divine power. Susanoo sent him into rooms filled with snakes, then into rooms filled with centipedes and wasps, then had him shot with arrows into a field which was set ablaze. Each time Okunanushi survived through cleverness, assistance from Susanoo's daughter Susurihime, whom he married, and his own developing resourcefulness. Finally, Okunanushi escaped from Susanoo's realm entirely, stealing the storm god's sword, bow, and harp on the way out. When Susanoo discovered the theft and gave chase, he could only shout advice from the border of his land. "Use those weapons to defeat your wicked brothers. Rule the land!" This blessing from Susanoo, however reluctantly given, legitimized Okunanushi's authority. He returned to the central land of Reed Plains and systematically defeated his 80 brothers. Then he set about the real work, organizing and civilizing the earthly realm. With his companion Sukanabikona, a tiny god of medicine and brewing, Okunanushi traveled across Japan establishing order, teaching agriculture, medicine, and proper ritual. They built shrines, designated sacred spaces, negotiated with local kami to bring them into a coherent system. Where there was wilderness, they brought cultivation. Where there was chaos, they established law. Where there was isolation, they created connection. This was the golden age of earthly divine rule. Okunanushi as the active, present deity making the land habitable for humans. He married multiple goddesses, extending his influence through alliance. His palace at Izumo became the center of political and religious power in the earthly realm. The central land of Reed Plains flourished under his governance. But even as Okunanushi established his sovereignty below, Amaterasu watched from above. The earthly realm had been pacified, yes, but not by her descendants, not by the celestial lineage. The land was ordered, but not subordinate to heaven. And in the Japanese mythological worldview, this situation could not stand. Heaven's sovereignty was universal, or it was nothing. The stage was being set for the next great transition. The descent of heaven's rule to earth, the subordination of Okuninushi's power to Amaterasu's will, and ultimately the origin of the imperial line itself in a complex negotiation between celestial authority and earthly reality. Amaterasu convened a council in the high celestial plane. The question before the assembled gods was straightforward but profound. The central land of Reed Plains, the earthly realm, was ruled by Okunanushi, a capable deity who had brought order to chaos, but he answered to no one. He was sovereign in his own right, descended from Susanoo rather than from Amaterasu herself. This created a troubling independence, a separate source of authority that challenged the celestial order's claim to universal rule. The gods debated. Should they simply accept this division, heaven above, earth below, each with its own legitimate ruler? Or should Amaterasu assert her primacy by bringing the earthly realm under celestial governance? The second option prevailed. The land of Japan, these islands born from the primordial chaos by Izanagi and Izanami, should be ruled by Amaterasu's descendants, not Susanoo's. But how to achieve this? Okunanushi was powerful, well-established, beloved by the earthly kami. Military conquest seemed unwise. The celestial gods decided on a different approach. Negotiation backed by overwhelming force. They would send emissaries to convince Okunanushi to cede authority voluntarily. The first emissary was Ame no Hohi, one of the 5 male gods born during the contest between Amaterasu and Susanoo. He descended to Earth with his mandate but never returned. Instead, he was apparently so charmed by Okunanushi, or so impressed by earthly sovereignty, that he switched sides entirely, becoming one of Akunanushi's retainers. Amaterasu tried again, sending Ame no Wakahiko, a different celestial god with a divine bow and arrows. But Wakahiko also failed his mission, though in a different way. He married Akunanushi's daughter, Shitaru Hime, and decided earthly pleasures were far superior to celestial duty. For 8 years, he sent no reports back to heaven, simply enjoying his new life as a powerful deity on earth with a beautiful divine wife. Amaterasu grew impatient. She sent a pheasant, Nakime, the crying woman bird, to investigate and demand answers. The pheasant perched on a tree outside Wakahiko's palace and called out the celestial command, "Why have you not reported back?" Wakahiko's servant saw the bird and told his master that an ill-omened creature was making terrible noise. Wakahiko, perhaps drunk or simply annoyed at being reminded of his abandoned duty, took the divine bow Amaterasu had given him and shot the pheasant dead. The arrow passed completely through the bird's body, travelled upward through the sky, and landed in the high celestial plane at the feet of Takamimasubi, one of the primordial creating deities. Takamimasubi examined the arrow and recognized it immediately as the one given to Wakahiko. "If this arrow was shot during righteous action against earthly rebels, may it cause no harm," he declared. He threw the arrow back through the hole it had created in the sky. It fell like divine judgment, straight and true, and struck Wakahiko in the chest as he lay sleeping beside his wife the next morning. He died instantly. His funeral became a great spectacle. The texts describe 8 days and 8 nights of mourning, elaborate rituals, the creation of a special mourning house. His wife Shitaru Hime wept so bitterly that her weeping reached heaven itself. The death of Wakahiko taught the celestial gods an important lesson. They needed to send someone who couldn't be seduced by earthly power, someone whose loyalty to heaven was absolute and whose nature was fundamentally martial. They chose Takemikazuchi no Kami, the thunder god, and Futsunushi no Kami, the sword god, deities of conquest and violence. These two descended not with soft words, but with overwhelming presence. The accounts say they came to the beach at Inasa in Izumo, Akunanushi's stronghold, and drove their swords point first into the sand, then sat cross-legged on the upturned blades, a posture of both rest and threat. They could spring into action at any moment, and their power was on full display. "Amaterasu has sent us," they announced when Okunanushi arrived to meet them. The central land of reed plains was created by celestial deities and should be ruled by Amaterasu's descendants. Okunanushi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said he needed to consult his sons. His eldest son, Kotoshiro Nushi, was out fishing. When messengers brought him the news of Heaven's ultimatum, he considered carefully. He understood the reality. Heaven commanded forces that could devastate the earthly realm. Resistance would mean war, and war would mean the destruction of everything Okunanushi had built. Better to negotiate favourable terms. "Submit to Heaven's will," Kotoshiro Nushi advised his father. Then, as a gesture demonstrating his commitment to this advice, he performed a remarkable act. He capsized his own boat and transformed it into a green brushwood fence, stepping backward into it and vanishing from the visible world. This wasn't death but voluntary withdrawal. He removed himself from the political equation entirely, making space for Heaven's rule. Okunanushi's other son, Takeminakata, had a different response. He was younger, more martial, less inclined to accept defeat without contest. When he heard the celestial ultimatum, he arrived at Inasa Beach carrying an enormous boulder. Accounts say it required 1,000 men to lift, held easily in his hands. He roared. Takamikazuchi accepted the challenge. Takaminakata grabbed the thunder god's hand, expecting his divine strength to crush it. But the hand transformed, first into a pillar of ice, then into a blade, impossible to grip. When Takamikazuchi grabbed Takaminakata's hand in return, he crushed it like a young reed. Then the chase began. Takaminakata fled, Takamikazuchi pursuing. They ran the length of Japan, from Izumo all the way to the distant lake of Suwa in the central mountains. Finally, cornered at the water's edge with nowhere left to run, Takaminakata surrendered. Takamikazuchi accepted this oath. Takaminakata became the guardian deity of Suwa, confined to that region forever, a powerful god but a local one, no longer a threat to Heaven's universal claims. Even today, the Suwa Grand Shrine in Nagano Prefecture honors him as a deity of hunting, wind and water, still bound by his ancient oath. With both sons dealt with, one voluntarily withdrawn, the other defeated and confined, Okunanushi finally gave his answer. He would cede political sovereignty over the visible world to Amaterasu's descendants, but he negotiated terms. He wanted his palace at Izumo maintained and honoured. He wanted recognition of his role in organising the earthly realm. And most importantly, he wanted authority over the invisible world, the realm of spirits, magic, mystical connections, and what lies beneath the surface of ordinary reality. This division became foundational to Japanese religious understanding. The emperor, descended from Amaterasu, ruled Utsushio, the manifest world of politics, agriculture, military power, visible order. Okunanushi ruled Kakuryō, the hidden world of spiritual matters, mysterious connections between people, especially marriage and romance, medicine, and magic. This is why even today, Izumo Taisha remains one of Japan's most important shrines, despite the Imperial line claiming solar descent. Okunanushi's domain never disappeared. It simply became invisible. Heaven agreed to these terms. The political order was established. Amaterasu's descendants would rule Japan as emperors, but they would always honour Okunanushi and acknowledge the spiritual realm's separate sovereignty. Every year in October, the month called Kanazuki, the month without gods everywhere else in Japan, all the kami were said to gather at Izumo for a great assembly. There, Okunanushi presided over matters of fate and fortune, particularly arranging marriages and relationships for the coming year. With this negotiation complete, Amaterasu prepared to send her grandson to rule the earthly realm. She chose Ninigi no Makoto, born from one of the 5 male gods she'd created during her contest with Susanoo. Ninigi was given 3 divine treasures: the mirror that had drawn Amaterasu from her cave, symbolizing wisdom and truth, the jewels from the sacred Sakaki tree, symbolizing benevolence, and the sword Susanoo had found in the Orochi's tail, symbolizing valor and martial power. When you look upon this mirror, Amaterasu instructed, regard it as if you're looking upon me. This command established the mirror as the primary imperial regalia, the physical manifestation of Amaterasu's presence with her earthly descendants. Ninigi descended through the clouds to a mountain peak in Kyushu, Takachiho in some accounts, a place where heaven seemed to touch earth, where the mountains rose so high they penetrated the clouds. With him came 5 attendant gods: Ame no Koyane, ancestor of the Nakatomi priestly clan; Futadama, ancestor of the Imbe ritual specialists; Ame no Uzume, the goddess whose bawdy dance had lured Amaterasu from the cave; Ishikoridome, who had forged the sacred mirror; and Tomoya, who had created the sacred jewels. These divine companions would become the ancestral deities of the clans that served the imperial house. Priests, mirror makers, jewelers, ritualists. The descent wasn't entirely smooth. When Ninigi's procession reached a crossroads in the heavenly path, they found a mysterious deity blocking the way, Saruta Hiko no Kami, the god of earthly crossroads, with a nose 7 handspans long and eyes like 8-hand mirrors, glowing red like winter cherries. He was intimidating, strange, neither clearly hostile nor friendly. Amaterasu sent Ame no Uzume to investigate, since she was bold enough to approach anyone. She walked up to Saruta Hiko and demanded to know his purpose. He explained he'd come specifically to guide the celestial procession safely to Earth. He knew the earthly roads and could ensure they didn't get lost in the transition between realms. In exchange, he wanted Uzume to accompany him and become his wife. This match between the bawdy celestial dancer and the earthy crossroads god created the Tsurume no Kimi clan, descendants who performed sacred dances at crossroads and boundaries, mediating between realms just as their divine ancestors had. Their rituals ensured safe passage for travellers, proper transitions at life thresholds, and maintained the connection between heaven and earth. Once on Earth in Kyushu, Ninigi established his palace and encountered an earthly woman of extraordinary beauty, Konohana Sakuya Hime, Princess Blossoms of the Trees, daughter of the mountain god Oyamatsumi. Ninigi was immediately smitten and asked her father for permission to marry. But Ninigi only wanted the beautiful younger sister. When the 2 women arrived at his palace, he sent Iwanaga Hime back, keeping only Sakuya Hime. The mountain god was deeply offended. "I offered both daughters for a reason," he explained. "Iwanagahime would have given you and your descendants eternal life, enduring as rocks endure. Sakuya Hime brings beauty and flourishing, but like cherry blossoms, her gifts are temporary. By rejecting Iwanagahime, you've chosen mortality for your line." This mythological moment explained why the Imperial line, despite divine descent, still experienced death. The emperors were gods made mortal by an ancestor's aesthetic choice, his preference for beauty over endurance. Sakuya Hime became pregnant after just one night with Ninigi, who doubted the child could be his so quickly. Perhaps she had been with an earthly man before their marriage. Furious at the accusation, Sakuya Hime built a sealed hut with no doors and set it ablaze while she was inside, vowing that if the children were truly divine, neither she nor they would be harmed by earthly fire. She gave birth to 3 sons in the burning hut, all healthy: Hodori, Hosusuri, and Huri. This trial by fire proved their divine paternity and established an important principle. Divine legitimacy must sometimes be tested, proven through ordeal rather than simply claimed through lineage. The third son, Huri, became the father of the next generation through a complex story involving a magical fish hook, a journey to the sea god's palace, and marriage to the dragon god's daughter. But that tale leads us forward into the final transitions, from purely mythological time into the semi-historical age, where gods still walked the earth but were beginning to fade, where the first emperor would arise and the age of the gods would give way to the age of men. The systems were now in place, celestial sovereignty expressed through earthly rule, a division between visible and invisible authority, the 3 sacred regalia symbolizing the qualities of proper governance, the establishment of clans with specific ritual functions, and the gradual mixing of divine and human through intermarriage. Japan had its founding mythology, its explanation for why things were as they were, its legitimation of social and political hierarchy. The age when gods walked the earth and their children ruled as divine kings represents the mythological pinnacle, the moment when heaven and earth achieved their perfect relationship. This wasn't the chaotic creativity of the primordial creation period, nor was it the purely celestial politics of Amaterasu's heavenly reign. This was the golden synthesis, divine authority embodied in earthly form, creating order while still maintaining direct connection to the supernatural. Huri, the third son born in Sakuya Hime's burning hut, embodied this synthesis perfectly. His story is preserved in remarkable detail in both the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, suggesting its importance to establishing the character of divine kingship just before it transitioned into merely human rule. Huri was a hunter, skilled with the bow, while his older brother Hodori was a fisherman, master of hook and line. The brothers represented complementary aspects of how humans extracted resources from nature, from land and sea respectively. One day, Huri suggested they exchange their tools just to experience each other's work. Hodori reluctantly agreed, lending his younger brother his most precious possession, a magical fish hook that never failed to catch fish. Huri went to the sea and tried fishing, but he had none of his brother's skill. Not only did he catch nothing, but he lost the magical hook entirely. It slipped from the line and sank into the depths. When Hodori demanded its return, Huri was desperate. He offered 500 replacement hooks, then 1,000, then 10,000, but Hodori refused them all. "I want my original hook, the one that was mine." Huri sat on the beach in despair, and there the sea god Shiotsuchi no Kami found him. Hearing the story, Shiotsuchi built a special basket boat with close-woven bamboo sides that water couldn't penetrate, and sent Huri down beneath the waves to the palace of Watatsumi, the great dragon god of the ocean. The sea god's palace was magnificent beyond any earthly construction, built of fish scales that shimmered with every ocean colour, surrounded by gardens where kelp grew in ordered rows and fish swam like court attendants. When Huri arrived, Watatsumi's daughter Toyotama Hime, luminous pearl princess, saw him and immediately recognized his divine nature. She told her father a god had come from the upper world. Watatsumi welcomed Huri lavishly, and the young god married Toyotama Hime. They lived in bliss beneath the sea for 3 years. Time moved differently there. 3 years felt like 3 days, or perhaps the opposite. The accounts are deliberately vague, but eventually Huri remembered his original purpose. He sighed deeply, and his wife, noticing this first unhappiness, asked what troubled him. He explained about the lost fishhook and his brother's implacable demand for its return. Toyotama Hime brought this problem to her father, who summoned all the fish of the ocean to a great assembly. He demanded. Most fish knew nothing, but finally the Red Sea bream reported that he had something stuck in his throat that had been bothering him for years. They opened the fish's mouth and extracted the missing fish hook. Watatsumi gave it to Hori along with 2 magical jewels, the Shio Mitsu Tama, which controlled the rising tide, and the Shio Hiru Tama, which controlled the receding tide. When you return to your brother, Watatsumi advised, give him the hook, but say it's a dirty hook, a poor hook. Then plant rice in your fields. I'll ensure they flourish while his fail. When Hoderi grows angry and attacks you, use the tide-rising jewel to flood his lands. Huri returned to land riding on the back of Wani, the sea crocodile or shark, and did exactly as instructed. He disparaged the hook as he returned it. He planted rice that grew abundantly while Hoderi's crops failed mysteriously. When Hoderi, driven by desperation and envy, raised an army to attack his younger brother, Huri used the tide-rising jewel. The ocean swelled and flooded Hoderi's lands. His army floundered in rising water, drowning and desperate. Hoderi cried. Huri used the tide-receding jewel, and the waters withdrew, but this conflict established the hierarchy permanently. Hoderi and his descendants would serve Huri's line forever. The magical control over tides symbolized sovereignty, the ability to give life through water and agriculture, and to take it away through flood and drought. But Huri's story wasn't finished. Toyotama Hime emerged from the sea pregnant with his child. She built a birthing hut on the beach thatched with cormorant feathers at the exact threshold between land and sea, neither fully in one realm nor the other. This prohibition should have been familiar to Huri. His ancestor Izanagi had violated a similar taboo when he looked upon Izanami in the underworld. These forbidden glimpses appear repeatedly in Japanese mythology, tests of trust that humans and even gods inevitably fail. Huri tried to obey. He waited outside the birthing hut while strange sounds emerged. Not quite human cries, something more primal and ancient. His curiosity grew unbearable. Finally, he couldn't resist. He peeked through a gap in the cormorant feathers. Inside, he saw not his beautiful wife, but an enormous dragon. A Waini like the creature that had carried him from the sea palace, writhing in the pain of childbirth. Her true form revealed in this moment of extreme vulnerability. When she realized he'd looked, her shame and anger were immediate. "You've broken your promise and seen my true nature," she cried. She gave birth to a son, Ugaya Fukiezu, brave cormorant thatch-roofed, named because the birthing hut wasn't quite finished when he arrived, and then fled back to the sea, sealing the boundary behind her. The passage between sea and land closed. She sent her younger sister Tamiori Hime, spirit-inviting princess, to nurse the child on land, but she herself never returned. This moment marks an important transition in the mythological timeline. The easy commerce between different realms, heaven and earth and sea, visible and invisible, was beginning to close. Boundaries were hardening. The age when gods and their offspring could freely move between worlds was ending. Each violation of taboo, each betrayal of trust, each forbidden glimpse narrowed the passages between realms a little more. Ugaya Fukiezu grew to adulthood and married his aunt Tamiori Hime, the spirit-inviting princess who had raised him. This marriage of nephew and aunt might seem transgressive to modern sensibilities, but in mythological terms, it represented the continued mixture of divine bloodlines, keeping the celestial heritage concentrated rather than diluted by marriage to purely earthly partners. They had 4 sons. The youngest, Kamiyamato Iwarabiko, would become known to history as Emperor Jimmu, the first emperor of Japan, the point where mythology transitions into highly mythologized history. With Jimmu, we reach the pinnacle's culmination, the moment when the age of the gods gives way to the age of men, though men still divine enough to maintain connection with the celestial realm. Jimmu's story is one of conquest and consolidation. He began in Kyushu, where his divine ancestors had first descended, but recognized that this periphery wasn't the proper center for ruling all of Japan. He led an expedition eastward, fighting various earthly kings and tribal leaders who didn't acknowledge his celestial mandate. The campaign took years, involved numerous battles and setbacks, required alliances with local deities and submission of earthly powers. The most significant resistance came from Nagasunehiko, a powerful earthly ruler in the Yamato region of central Honshu. Nagasunehiko had his own divine patron Nigihayahi, a god who had descended from heaven separately from Amaterasu's line. This created a problem. How could Jimmu claim universal sovereignty when another divine lineage already ruled the richest, most strategic region of Japan? The resolution came when Nigihayahi himself recognized that Jimmu's claim was more legitimate. Jimmu possessed the 3 sacred regalia given by Amaterasu, the mirror, jewels and sword that proved direct descent from the sun goddess. Nigihayahi's descent had been independent, outside the main celestial hierarchy. Faced with this reality, Nigihayahi killed his own earthly supporter Nagasunehiko and submitted to Jimmu's authority. This wasn't simple political opportunism in the mythological telling. It represented the proper ordering of divine hierarchies. Even separately descended celestial lineages acknowledged Amaterasu's primacy and the legitimacy of her direct descendants to rule. The consolidation was cosmic, not merely political. Jimmu established his capital at Kashihara in the Yamato Plain, in the geographic heart of Honshu. The date traditionally given for his enthronement is February 11th, 60 BCE, a date that's certainly mythological rather than historical, but one that remained Japan's national foundation day into the modern era. With this enthronement, the mythological structure was complete. The pinnacle had been reached and formalized, a divine emperor, descended from the sun goddess through an unbroken line, wielding the 3 sacred regalia, ruling from the center of Japan with the submission of all earthly powers and rival divine lineages. The visible world subordinated to celestial authority, the invisible world maintained by a Kininushi in parallel. The boundaries between realms still permeable enough that divine power remained active and present, but stable enough that chaos was constrained. This was the ideal moment, the perfect balance between divine and human, order and vitality, celestial mandate and earthly reality. In mythological terms, this is when everything worked exactly as it should. The emperor performed the rituals that maintained cosmic order. The harvests were abundant. The people knew their places. The gods received proper worship. Heaven's plan for Earth was fully realized. But pinnacles, by definition, cannot be sustained. The very perfection of this moment contained the seeds of its transformation. As emperors succeeded emperors and centuries accumulated, the divine blood would dilute through intermarriage with terrestrial nobles. The easy certainty of direct divine guidance would fade. Buddhism would arrive from the continent, introducing entirely new cosmological frameworks that would have to be integrated with indigenous traditions. Political power would shift from symbolic divine authority to actual military might. The gods wouldn't disappear, but they would gradually become more distant, more mediated by priests and ritual rather than direct presence. The age we're calling the pinnacle lasted, in mythological reckoning, only a few generations, from Ninigi's descent to Jimmu's consolidation. But those generations established everything that followed: the imperial institutions claimed to divine descent, the ritual frameworks that maintained cosmic order, the social hierarchies that reflected heavenly organization, and the fundamental Japanese understanding that their islands were special, chosen, the place where heaven most directly touched earth. The transition from purely mythological time to something approaching historical record is gradual and murky. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki continue listing emperors after Jimmu, giving them reigns and accomplishments, but the divine immediacy begins to fade. The stories become less fantastic, more political, more concerned with succession disputes and territorial control than with magical fishhooks or dragons disguised as princesses. This shift itself represents the first crack, not a catastrophic break, but a subtle cooling of the divine presence. The early emperors after Jimmu still claimed direct divine descent, still performed the necessary rituals, still wielded the sacred regalia. But something had changed. They didn't speak with gods face to face anymore. They didn't travel between realms. The boundaries that had been hardening since Huri glimpsed his wife's dragon form had now solidified almost completely. Consider Emperor Sujin, the 10th emperor, whose reign the chronicles place in the 1st century BCE. The texts call him Hatsukuni Shirasu Sumera Mikoto, His Majesty who first ruled the nation, a title suggesting that previous emperors were perhaps more mythological construct than actual rulers. Sujin's reign introduces recognizably historical concerns: taxation, census-taking, regional administration, managing the relationship between central authority and local powers. But most significantly, Sujin's reign introduces divine displeasure. Up until this point, the assumption had been that proper worship and ritual automatically ensured divine favor. The emperor performed the ceremonies, the gods blessed the land, the cycles continued. But during Sujin's time, a terrible plague swept through the realm. Many died. The survivors were terrorized and demoralized. Sujin consulted diviners to determine what offense had caused the gods to withdraw their protection. The answer was uncomfortable. Amaterasu and Yamato no Akunitama, the great deity of the Yamato region, were too powerful to be housed within the palace itself. Their sacred objects, particularly Amaterasu's mirror, the primary imperial regalia, needed to be moved to separate shrines where they could be worshipped properly without the contaminating proximity of daily political life. This represented a profound shift. Previously, divine power and political authority had been identical. The emperor was divine, therefore his residence was naturally the proper place for the most sacred objects. But now, a separation was being acknowledged. Sacred power needed its own space, its own specialists, its own protocols distinct from political governance. Sujin entrusted the mirror to his daughter, Toyosuke Irahime no Mikoto, who established temporary shrines for it, as she searched for the proper permanent location. Eventually, her successor Yamato Hime no Mikoto would establish the mirror at Ise, on the coast of Honshu, where it remains to this day in the inner shrine, the most sacred site in Shinto, forbidden to all but the imperial family and the highest priests. This geographical separation of sacred authority from political power was the first major crack in the mythological structure. It suggested that divine legitimacy required more than just bloodline. It required proper worship, correct ritual, and acknowledgement that the gods maintained their own prerogatives separate from earthly politics. Around the same time, another crack appeared in the mythological edifice, the arrival of outside influences that couldn't be easily integrated into the existing framework. The Korean kingdoms of Paekje, Silla, and Koguryo maintained complex relationships with the Yamato court, sometimes tributary, sometimes rival, always challenging the notion that Japan was the sole center of divine attention. Korean scholars and craftsmen brought Chinese writing which transformed Japanese culture fundamentally. Suddenly, there was a way to record things permanently, to create texts that could be consulted across generations. But writing also created distance. The difference between oral tradition, which remained fluid and adaptable, and written canon, which became fixed and subject to interpretation. The chronicles record that in the year 52 CE, though some sources say 538, the king of Paekje sent a mission to the Yamato court bearing a gift, a golden statue of Buddha and sutras explaining Buddhist teachings. This moment is often cited as the official introduction of Buddhism to Japan, though Buddhist objects and ideas had almost certainly arrived earlier through unofficial channels. The court was divided on how to respond. The Soga clan, increasingly powerful as imperial administrators, saw Buddhism as a sophisticated continental philosophy that could strengthen Japanese culture and provide a framework for more complex government. They advocated for accepting and promoting the new teaching. The Mononobe clan, traditional military leaders, and the Nakatomi clan, hereditary Shinto priests, opposed Buddhism violently. They saw it as a foreign contamination that threatened the indigenous gods. When plague struck shortly after the Buddha statue arrived, they claimed the kami were angry at this intrusion and demanded the statue be thrown into a canal. This conflict escalated into armed struggle. Not theological debate, but actual warfare between clan armies representing different visions of Japan's relationship with the divine and with continental culture. The Soga eventually prevailed militarily, establishing Buddhism's place in Japanese religious life, but the victory was messy and incomplete. Rather than replacing Shinto, Buddhism awkwardly coexisted with it, sometimes in synthesis, sometimes in tension, creating layers of religious practice that would characterize Japanese spirituality ever after. The introduction of Buddhism represented a crack in Japanese mythology's claim to completeness. Here was an entire cosmology, with its own creation stories, its own pantheon of Buddhas and bodhisattvas, its own explanations for suffering and paths to liberation, that operated on entirely different principles than the kami-centered indigenous tradition. The Japanese response was characteristically pragmatic. They accepted both. The kami became understood as manifestations of Buddhas, or as beings within the Buddhist cosmos who themselves needed enlightenment, or as complementary aspects of reality that Buddhism and Shinto explained from different angles. But this synthesis required extensive intellectual work and created theological complications that would occupy scholars for centuries. The easy certainty of the Age of Gods, when Amaterasu's descent simply explained everything, had given way to complex negotiations between competing frameworks. Political power also began fragmenting in ways that challenged the mythological model. The emperor remained the symbolic source of all authority, descended from Amaterasu, performing the necessary rituals. But actual governance increasingly passed to powerful clans like the Soga, who ruled in the emperor's name while the emperor himself became more ceremonial. The reign of Empress Suiko, 593 to 628 CE, illustrates this perfectly. She was empress, divine descendant, performer of rituals, but her nephew Prince Shotoku served as regent and wielded actual power, promulgating Buddhism, establishing the 17-article constitution, sending missions to China, reorganizing administration along continental models. The divine blood flowed through the empress, but innovation and governance happened through her regent. Prince Shotoku himself became a legendary figure. Histories credit him with supernatural wisdom. Buddhist texts claim he was a bodhisattva incarnate. Temples treasure his supposed relics. But he wasn't emperor. This created a new mythological problem. How could someone not of the direct imperial line possess such virtue and achieve such deeds? The answer developed gradually. The emperor's charisma, the divine mandate, could be expressed through loyal servants, even as the emperor remained the ultimate source. This was workable, but represented another crack: the diffusion of sacred authority through multiple channels, rather than concentrated in the single figure of the divine emperor. Environmental catastrophes also challenged the mythological framework. When earthquakes destroyed temples, when volcanic eruptions buried villages, when tsunamis devastated coastlines, the question arose: why weren't the rituals protecting the land? The emperor was performing the ceremonies. The shrines were maintained, offerings were made to the appropriate kami, yet disasters still struck. The mythological response was to expand the list of potentially offended deities, to increase the complexity of rituals, to find more subtle explanations for divine displeasure. Perhaps the problem was Goryo, vengeful spirits of people who died unjustly and weren't properly appeased. Perhaps certain kami had been neglected and needed attention. Perhaps Buddhism's arrival had disturbed relationships between different categories of spiritual beings. These explanations preserved the basic framework. Disasters still reflected spiritual causation, but they made the system more complex, more prone to competing interpretations, less immediate and obvious in its workings. By the 7th and 8th centuries CE, when the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were compiled, there was an explicit awareness that something had been lost. These texts were created precisely because oral traditions were fading. Old families who had preserved the ancient stories were dying out, and continental influences were transforming Japanese culture so rapidly that the indigenous traditions needed to be recorded before they disappeared entirely. The very act of writing down mythology changed its nature. Oral tradition had been living, adaptable, with different families and regions maintaining slightly different versions that could be negotiated and adjusted as circumstances required. Written text froze the stories, created a canon, made variation seem like error rather than natural multiplicity. The compilers made choices, which version of a story to include, how to reconcile contradictions, what to emphasize or minimize. These choices reflected the politics of their moment. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki both worked to legitimize the Yamato imperial line above all other possible claimants, to integrate Buddhism without undermining indigenous traditions, to present Japan as a coherent nation with a single origin story despite the obvious reality of multiple ethnic groups, regional or regional variations, and competing power centers. The cracks were becoming visible. The divine presence that had walked the earth in the Age of Gods had become mediated through texts, priests, complex rituals, and political institutions. The emperor was still divine, but increasingly symbolic. Buddhism coexisted with Shinto in ways that created as much confusion as synthesis. Continental models of governance competed with indigenous practices. Regional powers challenged central authority while still nominally acknowledging imperial sovereignty. None of these cracks represented catastrophic failure. The mythological framework remained intact and functional, but its perfection, that pinnacle moment when heaven's plan was fully realized on Earth, was clearly past. What came next was adaptation, transformation, and the gradual evolution of mythology from living cosmology into historical tradition. The Heian period, 794 to 1185 CE, witnessed Japanese civilization reaching extraordinary heights of cultural sophistication, elegant court poetry, magnificent architecture, refined aesthetic sensibilities. Yet beneath this flourishing surface, the mythological framework that had structured Japanese reality for centuries was coming undone. Its confident claims about divine order increasingly difficult to reconcile with the messy realities of political life. The imperial court moved to Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto, and created a world of exquisite beauty, codified ritual, and elaborate social hierarchies. Court life revolved around mastery of poetry, calligraphy, aesthetic discrimination, and the subtle politics of romantic intrigue. Lady Murasaki's tale of Genji, written in the early 11th century, captures this world perfectly. Sensitive, psychologically complex, preoccupied with beauty and impermanence, but notably lacking any direct interaction with the gods who supposedly founded the imperial line. The kami hadn't disappeared from Heian consciousness, but they had become distant, their will known primarily through professional intermediaries rather than direct presence. When Emperor Kanmu moved the capital to Heian-kyo, he did so partly to escape the Buddhist establishment in Nara that had grown too politically powerful. But the new capital still required extensive ritual purification, negotiation with local earth spirits, establishment of shrines at critical directional points to protect against spiritual threats. This proliferation of protective rituals revealed anxiety. If the emperor was truly Amaterasu's direct descendant, maintaining cosmic order through his very existence, why did the capital require such elaborate spiritual fortifications? The Heian answer involved Onmyodo, the yin-yang divination system imported from China, which mapped spiritual dangers geographically and temporally. The northeast was particularly threatening, the Kimon or Demon Gate, requiring special attention from Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines working in parallel. But the real unraveling was political. By the 9th century, the Fujiwara clan had perfected a system of control that maintained the imperial myth while gutting its substance. They married their daughters to emperors, then had the emperors abdicate young in favor of child heirs. The Fujiwara would serve as regents for these children, wielding actual power while the emperor, our divine descendant of Amaterasu, performed ceremonies and gave formal approval to decisions others made. This created an emperor who was simultaneously indispensable and impotent. His divine authority couldn't be questioned. To challenge the emperor's position was to challenge the fundamental structure of reality as Japanese mythology described it. But neither could he actually govern. The contradiction was managed through increasingly elaborate fictions. The emperor desired what the Fujiwara suggested. The gods were pleased with arrangements the Fujiwara negotiated. Divine will expressed itself through Fujiwara policy. Some emperors tried to resist. Emperor Uda, reigned 887-897, attempted to reduce Fujiwara influence by promoting other clans and eventually abdicating in favor of his son, while still young and vigorous, hoping to guide policy from behind the scenes as a retired emperor, Joko. This created another layer of complexity. Retired emperors maintaining influence separate from reigning emperors, both claiming some portion of divine authority, neither able to govern effectively against entrenched clan interests. The proliferation of power centers claiming legitimacy through connection to the imperial institution represented mythology's practical failure. In theory, there was one emperor, one divine will, one unbroken line from Amaterasu to the present. In practice, there were reigning emperors, retired emperors, multiple Fujiwara regents with overlapping authorities, Buddhist establishments with their own political agendas, and regional strongmen increasingly independent of central control. The mythology's response was to generate new narratives explaining complexity. The idea of Mappo became important, the latter days of the law, a Buddhist concept teaching that humanity was entering a degenerate age, when enlightenment became nearly impossible, and chaos would increasingly prevail. This explained why divine order seemed less stable without challenging the basic framework. It wasn't that Amaterasu's blessing had failed. Rather, the cosmos itself had entered a difficult phase where maintaining order required more effort and was less reliably successful. Regional powers were rising that the imperial mythology couldn't easily accommodate. The Taira and Minamoto clans, descended from imperial princes who'd been moved to provincial positions to prevent succession disputes, built military strength outside the capital's aesthetic bubble. They dealt with actual governance, suppressing bandits, managing land disputes, organizing rice production, maintaining armed forces. When violence erupted between these military clans in the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, the fighting was brutal and the stakes existential. The Taira had captured the child emperor Toku and held the sacred regalia. When they were finally defeated in the naval battle of Dan no Ura, the emperor's grandmother threw herself and the 6-year-old emperor into the sea rather than face capture, taking the sacred sword Kusanagi with them into the depths. This was catastrophic for the mythological framework. The sacred sword, pulled from the Orochi's tail by Susanoo given to Amaterasu, passed to Ninigi as he descended from heaven, carried by every emperor since, lost, sunk in the ocean, irrecoverable. One of the 3 physical objects that proved divine descent and legitimized imperial rule was gone. The response was to claim that what sank was a replica, that the true sword remained safe at Atsuta Shrine. But the very need for this claim revealed the system's vulnerability. Physical objects mattered. If the regalia could be lost in battle, if imperial heirs could be drowned by their own relatives to prevent capture, if the symbols of divine authority were subject to the fortunes of war, then what did divine descent actually guarantee? The victorious Minamoto established the Kamakura Bakufu, the shogunate, representing a fundamental restructuring of power. Minamoto no Yoritomo took the title Sei-i Tai-shogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, originally a temporary military appointment, and made it hereditary and permanent. The emperor remained in Kyoto, still divine, still performing rituals, still theoretically the source of all authority. But real power, military, judicial, administrative, now resided with the shogun in Kamakura. This created a dual structure that would persist for centuries. The emperor in Kyoto as sacred center, maintaining cosmic order through ritual. The shogun in Kamakura and later Edo, Tokyo, as political center, actually governing. The mythology adjusted to accommodate this by distinguishing between visible and invisible authority. The emperor ruled the spiritual realm, the shogun governed the manifest world, and somehow both derived their legitimacy from the divine framework established in the Age of Gods. But this was a much weaker claim than the original mythological vision of divine emperors, directly governing in accordance with heaven's will. It represented mythology's retreat from claims about political reality into a more abstract domain of spiritual authority that didn't necessarily translate into actual power. Buddhism continued transforming indigenous traditions. Pure Land Buddhism became popular, teaching that the present age was so corrupt that only calling on Amida Buddha's name could ensure salvation. This was psychologically appealing but undermined the indigenous mythology's claim that proper worship of the kami and imperial rituals maintained cosmic order. If salvation came from a Buddha, entirely outside the Japanese pantheon, what role did Amaterasu and her descendants actually play? Syncretism attempted to solve this problem. The Honji Suijaku theory proposed that kami were manifestations of Buddhas. Amaterasu was really Dainichi Buddha, Vairocana, appearing in Japanese form. This preserved the kami's importance while subordinating them to Buddhist cosmic hierarchy. But it also meant that Japanese mythology was no longer self-sufficient. It required Buddhist concepts to make sense, had become a subset of a larger continental system rather than a complete cosmology in itself. Natural disasters continued challenging divine order. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1293 killed over 23,000 people. Famines became more frequent and severe as the medieval warm period ended and colder conditions reduced crop yields. Epidemic diseases, especially smallpox and measles, swept repeatedly through a population with no immunity. Each disaster required explanation. Which kami or Buddha was offended? What ritual had been performed incorrectly? Which vengeful spirit needed appeasement? The proliferation of explanations revealed that the simple mythological framework, the gods were pleased or displeased based on proper worship, had become inadequate. The cosmos was more complex, more populated with spiritual entities of various types, more prone to disturbances that couldn't be easily traced to specific causes or addressed through standard rituals. By the 14th century, imperial authority had fragmented completely. The succession dispute between rival branches of the imperial family led to 2 competing courts, northern and southern, each claiming to be legitimate, each possessing some of the regalia or copies thereof, each performing imperial rituals, each insisting it represented the authentic continuation of Amaterasu's lineage. The mythological claim to a single unbroken divine succession was demonstrably false. There were 2 emperors, each calling the other a usurper. The resolution eventually came through military force. The Ashikaga shogunate backed the northern court, which eventually absorbed the southern court, creating the fiction of seamless continuity. But the damage was done. For 56 years, there had been competing divine authorities, proving that divine descent was subject to political negotiation rather than self-evident truth. Warrior culture increasingly dominated, and it had its own values that didn't always align with Imperial mythology. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty to one's lord above all else, personal honor maintained through violence and acceptance of death in battle as the highest virtue. These values had little connection to Amaterasu's solar benevolence or the agricultural rituals that supposedly maintained cosmic order. The mythology hadn't collapsed entirely. Emperors still performed ceremonies at the palace. The East shrines still maintained Amaterasu's worship. Families still traced their descent to gods who appeared in the Kajiki. But the system's coherence had unraveled. What remained was a collection of practices, beliefs, political fictions, and cultural memories that had lost their integration into a single explanatory framework that made sense of Japanese existence. The 16th century brought upheaval that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations. Japan fragmented into warring domains, the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, where regional daimyo fought constantly for territory and survival. The emperor in Kyoto became nearly irrelevant to anyone outside the immediate capital region. Imperial ceremonies sometimes had to be cancelled for lack of funds. Think about that. The divine descendant of Amaterasu, whose rituals supposedly maintained cosmic order, was too poor to perform those rituals. The mythological framework claimed the emperor was essential to reality's proper functioning. But reality continued quite fine without imperial ceremonies, suggesting those ceremonies didn't actually do what mythology claimed. Then something entirely outside the mythological framework arrived: Christianity. Portuguese traders reached Japan in 1543, bringing matchlock muskets that would revolutionize warfare. Jesuit missionaries arrived 6 years later, bringing a completely different cosmology. One God, not 8 million kami, original sin rather than natural purity, salvation through Christ rather than through honoring ancestors and local spirits. The individual soul's relationship with God taking precedence over family and social obligations. Some Japanese converted. Estimates vary, but by the early 17th century, there were perhaps 300,000 Japanese Christians, including several daimyo who converted their entire domains. This wasn't just accepting another religious system alongside existing ones, as Buddhism had been integrated. Christianity's exclusive truth claims challenged Japanese mythology at its foundation. If Christianity was true, then Izanagi and Izanami never created the Japanese islands through stirring the sea with a jeweled spear. Amaterasu wasn't divine, or if divine, was subordinate to the Christian god. The emperor's descent from the sun goddess was at best metaphorical, at worst fraudulent. The crisis this posed was fundamental. For 1,000 years, Japanese mythology had provided the framework for understanding Japan's place in the cosmos, the legitimacy of its rulers, the proper relationship between humans and the sacred. Now Portuguese priests were saying all of that was wrong, that the kami were demons or delusions, that the entire structure of Japanese religious life was leading people to damnation. Some daimyo found Christian teachings persuasive. Others saw Christianity as a tool for obtaining trade advantages with the Portuguese and Spanish, or as a way to challenge Buddhist institutions they resented. But the more thoughtful observers recognized the danger. If Japanese mythology was simply one set of stories among many, all equally valid or invalid, then what grounded Japanese identity? What made Japan special? What legitimized any particular form of authority? Oda Nobunaga, the first of 3 great unifiers who ended the Warring States period, was pragmatically tolerant of Christianity. He saw the Christians as useful allies against the entrenched Buddhist powers who opposed him politically. He protected Jesuit missionaries and allowed churches to be built. But there's no evidence he took Christian theology seriously. He simply used Christianity as a weapon against Buddhism. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who succeeded Nobunaga and came closest to unifying Japan, initially continued this tolerance. But as he consolidated power and his ambitions grew, he grew suspicious of Christianity's political implications. If people's ultimate loyalty was to God and the Pope rather than to their lord and emperor, how could order be maintained? In 1587, he issued an edict expelling Christian missionaries though enforcement was sporadic. The breaking point came in the early 17th century under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors. The Tokugawa shogunate, having finally unified Japan under its rule, saw Christianity as an existential threat to the order they'd established. They began systematic persecution, missionaries hunted down and executed, Japanese Christians forced to apostatize or face torture and death, entire Christian communities exterminated. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637–38 crystallized the regime's fears. A large-scale peasant uprising in Kyushu, motivated partly by Christian faith and partly by oppressive taxation, required a massive military effort to suppress. The Tokugawa concluded that Christianity had to be completely eliminated. They instituted the Fumae practice, forcing suspected Christians to step on images of Christ or Mary, proving their rejection of the foreign faith. Simultaneously, they closed Japan to almost all foreign contact, Sakoku, the closed country policy. A few Dutch traders were allowed at Nagasaki under strict supervision, as the Dutch weren't interested in religious conversion. But Spain and Portugal were excluded entirely, and Japanese were forbidden to leave the country or return from abroad on pain of death. This isolation preserved Japanese mythology by removing the challenge of competing cosmologies. Without Portuguese priests arguing that Japanese religious traditions were demonic, without the continuous arrival of foreign ideas and practices, indigenous traditions could be re-established and controlled. But the preservation came at enormous cost. Japan cut itself off from the wider world for over 2 centuries. Yet even in isolation, the mythological framework continued eroding from within. The Tokugawa peace, by ending constant warfare, removed the primary justification for warrior rule. If samurai existed to fight but there were no wars, why did they deserve their privileged status? The regime answered with Neo-Confucianism, emphasizing social order, hierarchical relationships, and stability over the kami-centered mythology. Education expanded, literacy increased, and with it came critical thinking. Scholars studying ancient texts began noticing contradictions between different accounts, anachronisms in dating, evidence of political motivations shaping the chronicles. Kokugaku, national learning, emerged as a movement trying to recover authentic Japanese traditions before Chinese and Buddhist contamination. But their scholarly methods, borrowed from European textual criticism via the Dutch connection, inadvertently demonstrated how constructed and edited the authentic traditions actually were. Motori Norinaga, 1730s to 1801, the greatest Kokugaku scholar, spent years producing a meticulous commentary on the Kojiki, arguing that its myths preserved genuine ancient Japanese spirituality. But his very need to explain and interpret the myths showed they weren't self-evident anymore. They required scholarly mediation, historical context, explanation of archaic language. They'd become antiquarian curiosities rather than living cosmology. Meanwhile, the emperor in Kyoto remained politically irrelevant. The shogun ruled from Edo, modern Tokyo, and most Japanese lived their entire lives without thinking about the emperor, except as an abstract concept. When the Emperor Go-Mizunoo tried to assert even symbolic authority by visiting a shrine without shogunal permission, he was severely reprimanded. The divine descendant of Amaterasu served at the pleasure of a military dictator descended from nothing more than successfully violent ancestors. The breaking point came in the mid-19th century when Commodore Perry's Black Ships arrived in 1853, demanding Japan open to trade. The shogunate, confronted with technology demonstrating Western power, was forced to sign unequal treaties. This humiliation exposed the regime's weakness and triggered the question: if the shogun couldn't protect Japan, what justified his rule? Paradoxically, the mythology enthusiast that had become nearly irrelevant suddenly became revolutionary. They argued that the shogunate usurped authority properly belonging to the emperor, and that restoring imperial rule would give Japan the spiritual strength to resist Western encroachment. This was historically bizarre. The emperor hadn't actually governed in 1,000 years, but it was mythologically perfect. The ancient claims about divine descent, celestial mandate, and the emperor's essential role in cosmic order became weapons for dismantling a political system that had made those claims irrelevant. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 restored the emperor to power, in reality created a new oligarchy ruling in the emperor's name, but at least the fiction was different. The young Emperor Meiji was moved from Kyoto to Edo, renamed Tokyo, and transformed from powerless religious figurehead into modern monarch. The slogan shifted to Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong military, and Japan embarked on rapid modernization modelled explicitly on Western powers. But here was the final breaking point for the old mythology. Modernization required Western science, Western military organization, Western education, Western governmental structures. The Meiji regime adopted all of these while insisting they were restoring ancient Japanese traditions. The contradiction was glaring but politically necessary. They created state Shinto, a constructed tradition claiming to be ancient, declaring Shinto the national religion, though Shinto historically hadn't been organized as a unified religion, subordinating Buddhist institutions, and placing the emperor at the center of a cult of national identity. Emperor worship became compulsory. Shrines were built in every neighborhood. Children were taught that the emperor was divine and Japan was uniquely blessed by the gods. But this state Shinto was fundamentally different from the organic mythology of the Age of Gods. It was deliberately created by politicians and ideologues, used instrumentally to build national unity and justify military expansion. The old myths were simplified into propaganda. Amaterasu became the grandmother of the nation. Jimmu's legendary conquest became a model for imperial expansion into Korea and China. The divine land needed Lebensraum and resources to fulfill its cosmic destiny. The mythology that had once explained the natural world and legitimized traditional authority was now weaponized to justify imperialism and ultimately the catastrophe of World War II. Emperor Hirohito was presented as a living god whose will could not be questioned, even as that divine will led to millions of deaths. When Japan surrendered in 1945, one of the American occupation's requirements was that Emperor Hirohito renounce his divinity. On January 1, 1946, he issued the Ningen Sengen, the Humanity Declaration, stating that the ties between him and his people did not rest on mere legends and myths, that he was not an Akitsumakami, a manifest deity in human form. This moment represents mythology's complete breaking. For 3,000 years, in mythological reckoning, since Izanagi and Izanami stirred the primordial ocean, the framework had claimed Japanese emperors were actually divine, literally descended from the sun goddess, maintaining cosmic order through their rituals and existence. Now the emperor himself said this wasn't true, that it was mere legends and myths rather than reality. Everything built on that foundation, the claims about Japan's special status, the emperor's unique role, the kami's active presence in Japanese history, was revealed as constructed narrative rather than cosmic truth. The breaking point wasn't gradual erosion. It was the emperor himself, under pressure from foreign military occupation, saying the central claim of Japanese mythology was false. After the breaking point, you might expect complete abandonment. The mythology discredited, the old stories forgotten, the shrines demolished, the traditions discarded as embarrassing relics of a discredited past. But that's not what happened. Instead, something stranger and more interesting emerged. The mythology continued, transformed, stripped of its political claims but still present in Japanese cultural life. The American occupation, despite requiring Hirohito's renunciation of divinity, didn't dismantle Shinto. They separated it from the state, prohibited compulsory shrine visits, and ended governmental support for religious institutions. State Shinto as a political ideology was abolished, but Shinto as religious practice, as cultural tradition, as a framework for rituals marking life transitions, this was allowed to continue as private voluntary activity. What survived was the deep structure, the patterns of thought and practice embedded so thoroughly in Japanese culture that they persisted regardless of whether people believed the literal myths, the habit of visiting shrines at New Year's to pray for good fortune, the practice of stopping at roadside Jizo statues to honor dead children, the Matsuri festivals celebrating local kami, the wedding ceremonies at shrines, the funeral rites at Buddhist temples, the sense that mountains, forests, certain rocks and waterfalls possess something sacred that commands respect. The mythology had become cultural vocabulary rather than cosmological truth. Japanese people could be completely secular, doubting any supernatural claims, yet still participate in shrine visits because that's what you did at certain times and places. The gods became optional. You might believe in their literal existence, understand them as metaphors, or simply appreciate the aesthetic and social aspects of traditional practice without committing to any particular ontological claim. Ise Shrine, where Amaterasu's mirror is enshrined, remains one of Japan's most visited sites. Every 20 years, the shrine buildings are completely rebuilt, an ancient practice called shikinen sengu that preserves traditional craftsmanship and ensures continuous renewal. Millions visit, particularly during New Year's celebrations. They're not all asserting belief that Amaterasu literally created Japan or that the emperor is her divine descendant. They're participating in cultural continuity, honoring tradition, experiencing connection to something that extends beyond their individual lives. The mythology survived as story, powerful narratives that remained culturally resonant even without cosmological authority. Amaterasu's withdrawal to the cave became a metaphor for depression and the community's role in drawing people back to life. Izanagi's descent to Yomi to retrieve his wife became an archetypal story about grief and the irreversibility of death. Susanoo's transformation from destructive troublemaker to heroic dragon slayer became a narrative about redemption and the civilizing power of love. These stories appeared in education, not as religious instruction, but as cultural heritage. Students learned the myths the way Western students learn Greek mythology, as foundational narratives that shaped the culture, influenced literature and art, provided reference points for understanding more sophisticated works. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki became classics studied for their literary and historical value rather than religious truth. Popular culture absorbed the mythology voraciously. The proliferation of manga, anime, and video games created after World War II constantly referenced kami, mythological creatures, and narrative patterns from traditional stories. Naruto features characters named after mythological deities. Princess Mononoke reimagines the conflict between nature spirits and human development. Okami retells Amaterasu's story as an adventure game, where the player embodies the sun goddess as a wolf. This pop culture recycling did something interesting. It kept the mythology alive and evolving without requiring belief. Young Japanese people who never attend shrine except at New Year's and consider themselves non-religious still know the basic mythology. They've encountered it through entertainment that reinterprets and reimagines rather than preserves unchanged. The mythology became creative resource rather than sacred text. The imperial institution itself survived, transformed into a constitutional monarchy where the emperor performs purely ceremonial functions. The current Emperor Naruhito's enthronement in 2019 included the Daijosai, the Great Thanksgiving ceremony where the emperor communes with Amaterasu. This ancient ritual, preserved in recognizable form for over 1,000 years, was performed in the 21st century for an emperor who makes no claims to divinity, before a population mostly watching on television or streaming, in a country where religion is personal choice. The contradiction is managed through layering. At another level, it acknowledges Shinto as cultural heritage worthy of preservation. At yet another level, for those who choose to engage religiously, it maintains genuine spiritual significance. All these interpretations coexist without requiring resolution. Academic study of Japanese mythology flourished in the post-war period. Historians and anthropologists analyzed the myth's origins, traced Chinese and Korean influences, identified how different versions served different political purposes. This scholarship demystified the mythology, even as it revealed its richness and complexity. The stories became objects of study rather than sources of unquestioned authority, but scholarly analysis didn't kill popular engagement. If anything, it enabled more sophisticated appreciation. Understanding how the myths were constructed and why they took particular forms made them more interesting, not less. The Kojiki could be appreciated simultaneously as political propaganda, literary achievement, historical source material and spiritual text. Regional traditions proved remarkably persistent. Local shrines maintained their specific kami and festivals regardless of whether these had any place in the official mythology compiled in the 8th century. Fishing villages still honoured sea deities. Mountain communities maintained their own creation stories. Urban neighbourhoods had guardian spirits whose worship required no reference to Amaterasu or imperial descent. The centre hadn't held, but the periphery continued quite well on its own. Diaspora communities carried the mythology abroad. Japanese immigrants to Hawaii, California, Brazil, Peru built shrines and maintained festivals in their new homes. These traditions evolved in different directions, mixing with local practices, sometimes becoming more authentically Japanese than contemporary practice in Japan itself, the immigrant impulse to preserve what was left behind. The mythology also became part of Western New Age and neo-pagan movements. People attracted to polytheism, nature worship, or alternative spiritual frameworks found Japanese mythology appealing. They created their own interpretations, often historically inaccurate but spiritually meaningful to practitioners, honoring kami, celebrating seasonal festivals, adapting Japanese concepts to non-Japanese contexts. Some Japanese observers found this appropriation offensive. Others saw it as proof of the mythology's continued vitality. If people on different continents found meaning in Amaterasu or Inari or Susanoo, the stories possessed something universal even if they originated in specifically Japanese circumstances. What remained after the breaking point then was neither complete loss nor unchanged preservation. It was transformation, the mythology continuing as cultural resource, narrative pattern, aesthetic sensibility, ritual framework, and philosophical vocabulary, rather than as cosmological explanation or political legitimation. The stories persisted because they addressed enduring human concerns. How do we relate to nature? What makes authority legitimate? How do we navigate boundaries between different realms of experience? What do we owe our ancestors? How should we understand death? What makes a life meaningful? The specifically Japanese answers to these questions had lost their claim to cosmic truth, but they remained one way humans had worked through fundamental challenges. Perhaps most importantly, what remained was the sense that the past mattered, not as something to replicate, not as golden age to which return was possible, but as living presence that shaped identity and provided resources for meaning-making. The mythology became heritage rather than destiny, memory rather than program, tradition rather than obligation. This might seem like diminishment from cosmic truth to cultural artifact, but it also represented liberation. Without the mythology's political weaponization, without compulsory belief, without claims to exclusive truth, it became something people could engage with freely, interpret creatively, and find personally meaningful without requiring institutional authority to validate their experience. The most remarkable aspect of Japanese mythology's legacy isn't what remained in Japan, but how it dispersed outward, influencing global culture in ways its original tellers couldn't have imagined. A mythology that began as an explanation for how Japanese islands emerged from primordial chaos became, in the 21st century, a source for video games, fashion aesthetics, philosophical concepts, and spiritual practices worldwide. Consider the concept of kami itself. Originally specific spirits in specific locations with specific personalities and requirements, kami has entered global vocabulary as a way of understanding the sacred that differs from Western monotheism. The idea that divinity pervades the natural world, that every mountain, river, and ancient tree might house sacred presence. This resonates with environmental concerns and ecological spirituality in ways monotheistic traditions struggle to match. Western environmentalists discovered Shinto, or at least their interpretation of it, and found a religious framework that seemed to sanctify nature itself, rather than viewing it as mere backdrop for human drama. Whether this understanding is accurate to how Japanese people actually relate to kami is debatable, but the influence is real. Environmental activists invoke Shinto principles. Conservation organizations reference the Satoyama concept of harmonious human-nature coexistence. The mythology's legacy includes contributing to how contemporary people worldwide think about environmental ethics. The aesthetic sensibility developed in cultures shaped by Japanese mythology has achieved global influence far disproportionate to Japan's size. Wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection and impermanence, derives partly from Buddhist philosophy, but also from indigenous Japanese attitudes about transience, the beauty of decay, acceptance of natural cycles. This aesthetic informs contemporary design, architecture, art and lifestyle movements worldwide. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, sensitivity to ephemeral beauty, became central to Japanese cultural identity, specifically through reflection on mythology's themes. The cherry blossoms that bloom briefly then fall, Izanami's death contaminating creation with mortality, the inevitable decline from golden ages, the beauty precisely in not lasting forever. This sensibility shaped Japanese literature, theatre, and art forms like ikebana, flower arrangement, where arrangements incorporate death and decay as essential elements, not failures. These aesthetic concepts entered global consciousness through Japanese film directors like Kurosawa and Ozu, through design movements like minimalism, through contemporary artists working in various media. Someone arranging an artfully imperfect ceramic tea bowl in Brooklyn is participating, however distantly, in a tradition that traces back to mythological attitudes about impermanence and the sacred in everyday objects. Martial arts practice, now global, carries mythology forward in embodied form. Aikido founder Morihei Ueshiba explicitly framed his art as expressing Shinto principles, the harmonious resolution of conflict, aligning with natural forces rather than opposing them, techniques named after kami and mythological concepts. Practitioners worldwide may not know the mythology explicitly, but they're learning movement patterns and philosophical frameworks that originated in that tradition. Anime and manga's global popularity made Japanese mythological motifs familiar to generations who've never read the Kojiki. Characters named Susanoo, Izanami, or Tsukuyomi appear across franchises. Story structures echo mythological patterns, heroes descending to underworlds, objects with divine power, transformations between human and animal or spirit forms. The eight-headed Orochi appears and reappears across different series, reimagined but recognizable. Studio Ghibli films, particularly those directed by Hayao Miyazaki, introduced global audiences to Japanese mythological sensibilities even when not explicitly retelling myths. Spirited Away's Bathhouse for Spirits, Princess Mononoke's Forest Gods, My Neighbor, Totoro's Gentle Nature Spirits. These films taught viewers worldwide how Japanese mythology understands the relationship between human and spirit realms, the sacredness of thresholds, the importance of proper ritual behavior. Video games proved remarkably effective vehicles for mythological transmission. Games like Okami, Persona, Final Fantasy, and countless others incorporated mythological content, not as dry reference, but as interactive experience. Players embody gods, collect mythological items, navigate worlds structured by Japanese cosmological principles. They learn mythology through play rather than study, internalizing narrative patterns and symbolic systems. This ludic transmission creates interesting distortions and evolutions. The mythology becomes simplified, exaggerated, combined with other traditions, reshaped to fit game mechanics. But it also becomes personally meaningful in ways academic study rarely achieves. A player who's spent 60 hours guiding Amaterasu through Okami's reimagined mythological landscape has a relationship with that mythology, however non-traditional, that shapes their imagination. The mythology's influence on Western occultism and alternative spirituality is perhaps most unexpected. Starting in the 20th century, Western magical practitioners began incorporating Japanese elements, not always accurately, but with genuine engagement. Chaos magicians invoked kami, neo-pagans celebrated Japanese festivals, New Age practitioners adopted kotodama, word spirit, practices, and misogi purification rituals. These Western interpretations horrified traditional Shinto priests, but demonstrated the mythology's continued power to generate new meanings. Academic study of Japanese mythology influenced broader theories of myth and religion. Joseph Campbell's comparative mythology drew on Japanese examples. Scholars of religion used Shinto to challenge Christian-centric definitions of religion. If Shinto counted as religion, maybe the category needed expansion to include traditions without creator gods, universal morality, or concern with afterlife salvation. The mythology influenced political philosophy too. Debates about nationalism, ethnic identity, and cultural authenticity frequently reference Japan's example. How did a mythology so explicitly ethnocentric, claiming divine descent specifically for Japanese emperors, portraying Japan as divinely special, coexist with successful modernization and eventually liberal democracy? The Japanese experience became a test case for arguments about whether ethnic nationalism could be civic, and whether traditional cultural identities could accommodate pluralism. Corporate culture absorbed mythological patterns. The Japanese business model, when it was globally influential in the 80s, reflected Shinto organizational principles. Consensus decision-making, echoing the Council of 800 Gods, lifetime employment as a modern version of clan loyalty, company rituals adapted from shrine ceremonies. Whether these connections were deliberately cultivated or unconsciously replicated, they suggested mythology's influence persisted, even in supposedly secular institutions. Language itself carried mythological concepts worldwide. Words like kamikaze, divine wind, tsunami, harbor wave, sake, sacred rice wine, samurai, one who serves, and shogun entered English with mythological or historical freight. Using them required at least minimal awareness of Japanese cultural context, which created opportunities for deeper engagement with the mythology behind them. Tourism became a vehicle for mythological transmission. Visitors to Japan encountered shrines and myths, not through texts but through material culture and ritual practice, walking through torii gates, observing priests perform ceremonies, receiving omamori, protective amulets, participating in festivals. Tourists experienced the mythology phenomenologically, understanding it through embodied practice rather than cognitive assent to propositions. This experiential transmission meant people could engage the mythology without believing it in any conventional sense. You don't have to believe Amaterasu literally created Japan to appreciate East Shrine's architectural beauty or feel the solemnity of its rituals. The mythology became available as aesthetic and spiritual resource even to those who rejected its cosmological claims. Academic conferences, museum exhibitions, and cultural exchanges created global communities of people engaged with Japanese mythology professionally. Scholars in Tokyo, Oxford, Berkeley, and Melbourne collaborated on translations, interpretations, and comparative analyses. Museums worldwide mounted exhibitions exploring kami, sacred objects, and mythological art. These institutional frameworks ensured the mythology remained an object of serious study and public engagement. Publishing proved crucial to the mythology's afterlife. Translations of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki multiplied. Not just academic editions, but popular adaptations, illustrated versions for children, feminist retellings, graphic novel interpretations. Each translation made choices about how to render archaic language, which episodes to emphasize, how to handle culturally specific concepts. These choices shaped non-Japanese understanding of the mythology, creating versions adapted for different audiences and purposes. The mythology influenced contemporary Japanese writers and artists who reinterpreted traditional themes for modern contexts. Kenzaburo Oe's novels reference mythological motifs while addressing the post-war trauma. Takashi Murakami's art incorporated kami imagery in pop art contexts. These artists used mythology not as historical preservation, but as living resource for addressing contemporary concerns, proof that the tradition remained generative. International adoptees of Japanese cultural practices sometimes engaged the mythology more intensely than average Japanese people. Serious Aikido practitioners studied Shinto philosophy. Tea ceremony students learned about ritual purity and sacred space. These non-Japanese engaged the mythology on its own terms rather than as heritage, sometimes developing deeper knowledge than native Japanese for whom it was background noise rather than chosen path. What emerged was a strange situation. Japanese mythology no longer primarily functioned in Japan to explain Japanese reality, but it circulated globally as cultural resource, aesthetic vocabulary, spiritual option, philosophical framework, entertainment property, and academic subject. The mythology's afterlife was dispersion and transformation, becoming many things to many people rather than remaining one authoritative tradition. This diaspora and diversification would have been incomprehensible to the Kojiki's compilers, who wrote to establish a single authoritative account of Japanese origins and imperial legitimacy. They created a closed canon. Its legacy was infinite proliferation, countless retellings, interpretations, adaptations, each valid in its own context, even when contradicting others. The mythology became, ironically, more alive through this fragmentation than it had been as rigid orthodoxy. When state Shinto tried to freeze the myths into propaganda, they became dead, useful for political manipulation but spiritually hollow. When post-war culture released them to evolve freely, they became generative again, producing new meanings and applications the original mythmakers never imagined. Perhaps most significantly, the mythology's afterlife demonstrated something important about how cultural traditions survive modernity. They don't preserve unchanged in museum cases. They don't disappear entirely when their original functions become obsolete. Instead, they transform, becoming available for new purposes, generating new meanings, finding new audiences, adapting to contexts their origins never anticipated. The kami who once explained why rice grew in particular valleys now inspire environmentalists worldwide. The sun goddess whose mirror legitimized emperors now appears in video games teaching global players about Japanese aesthetics. The storm god who slew the eight-headed serpent becomes a metaphor for confronting inner demons in contemporary manga. The myths continue, but their continuity includes radical transformation. The 20th and 21st centuries brought unprecedented scholarly attention to Japanese mythology, not from believers seeking religious truth or politicians weaponizing tradition, but from historians, anthropologists, folklorists, and literary scholars treating the myths as complex cultural artifacts worthy of rigorous analysis. Archaeological discoveries transformed understanding of Japan's ancient past. Excavations revealed that Yayoi period, 300 BCE, 300 CE, Japan had extensive contact with Korean kingdoms and China, contradicting mythological claims of unique, isolated development. The mythology's account of primordial creation and purely indigenous origins couldn't be reconciled with material evidence of continental influence, migration, and cultural exchange. Bronze mirrors discovered in elite tombs dating to the Kofun period, 250 to 538 CE, provided physical evidence for Korean and Chinese manufacturing techniques and religious practices entering Japan. Some mirrors bore Chinese cosmological symbols, hardly what you'd expect if the indigenous mythology represented unchanging truth transmitted from the age of gods. The mirrors suggested syncretism and adaptation rather than pure tradition. Linguistic analysis revealed that many supposedly indigenous Japanese words and concepts showed Korean or Chinese etymological roots. The mythology's claim to represent purely Japanese origins became harder to maintain when the language used to tell the myths incorporated foreign elements. Even the word kami itself had possible connections to Korean shamanic terms. DNA studies of the Japanese population demonstrated multiple waves of migration from the Asian mainland, with the Jomon people, indigenous hunter-gatherers, mixing with Yayoi agriculturalists from Korea, then later populations arriving from various directions. The mythology's assumption of a unified Japanese people descended from common divine ancestors didn't match genetic reality. The Japanese, like most populations, resulted from mixing. These scientific findings didn't destroy the mythology, but they required new interpretations. Scholars began reading the myths not as historical accounts, but as political documents, texts composed in the 8th century to legitimize Yamato clan dominance by claiming direct divine descent while subordinating rival clans and regional powers to supporting roles. Close textual analysis of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki revealed their constructed nature. The compilers had made deliberate choices, which regional traditions to include, how to resolve contradictions between different versions, where to place emphasis. Reading the texts with attention to what was excluded or marginalized proved as revealing as reading what was included. For example, Izumo mythology, centered on Okuninushi, preserved alternative traditions where Izumo rather than Yamato represented the center of divine authority. The myth of Okuninushi's voluntary submission to Amaterasu's descendants could be read as mythologizing actual political conquest, with the conquered people's gods incorporated into the victor's pantheon, but subordinated hierarchically. The prominence of Susanoo, associated with Korea in some scholarly interpretations, raised questions about whether his integration into the mythology represented historical Korean influence being naturalized into Japanese tradition. His initial rejection from heaven, followed by heroic redemption in Izumo, might encode memories of foreign gods or foreign peoples being eventually accepted, but only after proving their loyalty to indigenous authority. Feminist scholars offered radically new interpretations. Amaterasu's centrality as a female supreme deity seemed to suggest ancient matriarchal elements, but historians noted that by the time the Kojiki was compiled, Japanese society was thoroughly patriarchal. Was Amaterasu a remnant of earlier gender egalitarianism, or was her elevation as sun goddess compatible with, even reinforcing male dominance, the heavenly empress justifying earthly male emperor's rule, with actual women excluded from succession? The story of Izanagi and Izanami's first failed creation, because Izanami spoke first during the marriage ritual, seemed to encode explicit patriarchal values. Proper cosmic order required male initiative, female response. Feminist readers noted how this myth naturalized gender hierarchy by making it essential to successful creation. Izanami's transformation into the polluting goddess of death resonated with how Japanese culture treated women's bodies as sources of ritual impurity, menstruation, childbirth, death, all categorized as kegroi, requiring purification. Some feminist scholars saw the mythology as encoding and perpetuating misogynistic attitudes about women's dangerous, polluting nature. But other feminist interpreters found subversive elements. Amaterasu's power exceeded any male gods. Ame no Uzume's bawdy sexual dance saved the world when male gods' strategies had failed. Female deities possessed crucial knowledge and abilities. Perhaps the mythology preserved traces of women's power that later patriarchal interpretation couldn't completely erase. LGBTQ+ scholars noticed mythological fluidity around gender and sexuality. Gods shape-shifting between forms, creating without opposite-sex partners. The rabbit of Inaba, whose gender remains ambiguous in some tellings. These elements suggested Japanese mythology allowed more gender variance than later rigid categories imposed. Comparative mythology placed Japanese myths in global context. The descent to the underworld echoed Orpheus and Eurydice, Inanna's journey, Persephone's abduction. The flood myths, though less prominent in Japanese tradition, paralleled Near Eastern and South Asian accounts. The dying and rising deity pattern appeared cross-culturally. This suggested either universal human psychological patterns generating similar myths, or extensive cultural diffusion, or both. Post-colonial scholars examined how Japanese mythology was weaponized during imperial expansion. The mythology of divine descent and Japan as uniquely blessed sacred land justified colonizing Korea, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia as liberating these territories into the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The mythology became ideology supporting militarism and atrocity. This imperial history tainted the mythology for many. How could traditions that justified such violence be reclaimed? Some argued they couldn't. The mythology was irredeemably compromised. Others insisted that distinguishing between myths themselves and their political misuse was essential. Stories about gods creating islands weren't inherently fascist. They'd been made fascist through deliberate interpretation. Ecological interpretations emerged as environmental concerns grew. The mythology's attention to nature spirits, sacred groves, purifying waters seemed to offer resources for environmental ethics. But scholars debated whether this romanticized Shinto. The historical record showed plenty of environmental degradation in Japanese history, despite kami worship. Perhaps the mythology's ecological potential was more about contemporary projection than historical reality. Psychological interpretations applied Jungian analysis, reading kami as archetypes and myths as mapping the psyche's structure. Amaterasu became the self. Susanoo, the shadow, Izanagi's journey to Yomi represented ego confronting the unconscious. These readings treated mythology as spiritual and psychological wisdom rather than historical or cosmological claim. Some Japanese intellectuals resisted Western interpretative frameworks being imposed on indigenous traditions. They argued that reading Japanese myths through Christian, Freudian, or feminist lenses distorted their original meanings. The mythology needed to be understood on its own terms through indigenous philosophical frameworks. But what were those indigenous frameworks? Centuries of Chinese, Buddhist, and Western influence meant pure Japanese interpretation was itself a construction. There was no neutral position. All interpretation happened through conceptual lenses shaped by history and culture. Digital humanities brought new methodological tools. Computational analysis of mythological narratives identified patterns, tracked how stories evolved across different texts, mapped relationships between deities quantitatively. Databases made comprehensive comparison possible. Every occurrence of a particular kami across all texts could be analyzed together. Virtual reconstructions of ancient shrines and palaces helped visualize the material contexts where mythological rituals occurred. Archaeological sites could be explored digitally by students and scholars worldwide. The mythology became accessible in unprecedented ways, though some worried that digital mediation flattened the embodied, experiential dimensions essential to understanding. Contemporary Japan remained ambivalent about its mythology. The imperial system's post-war transformation left mythology politically awkward, neither fully embraced nor explicitly rejected, a source of both national pride and historical embarrassment. School curricula taught the myths as cultural heritage, carefully distinguishing between mythological account and historical fact, but the emotional and spiritual weight varied enormously depending on teachers' and families' attitudes. Some Japanese intellectuals advocated fully secularizing the mythology, treating it purely as literature and cultural tradition with no religious claims. Others argued that stripping mythology of spiritual dimensions reduced it to mere story, losing the depth that made it culturally significant. The debate continued without resolution. International scholarly conferences brought together researchers from multiple disciplines and nations, creating truly global conversation about Japanese mythology's meanings and significance. These exchanges revealed how differently the myths appeared from various perspectives. What Japanese scholars assumed as obvious background required explicit explanation for Western audiences, while Western theoretical frameworks often seemed foreign or forced to Japanese participants. What emerged from this century of intensive scholarly attention was a mythology far more complex, contested, and interesting than either traditional religious interpretation or modern nationalist propaganda had allowed. The myths weren't simple stories with clear meanings. They were layered texts encoding multiple agendas, preserving traces of various historical moments, susceptible to radically different readings depending on interpretive lens and the reader's position. The discovery, or perhaps creation, of this complexity represented its own kind of modernity. Pre-modern interpreters generally assumed myths had single correct meanings, whether religious or political. Modern scholarship demonstrated the myth's irreducible multiplicity. They meant many things simultaneously, and no interpretation could exhaust their significance. This scholarly understanding filtered slowly into popular consciousness. Museum exhibitions, educational programming, popular histories gradually taught that mythology was complex, constructed, interpretable, not rigid tradition to be accepted or rejected wholesale, but flexible resource for thinking about identity, values, and meaning. The question became not whether Japanese mythology was true, but what kinds of truth it offered. Psychological truths about human nature, sociological truths about how communities form identity, aesthetic truths about beauty and impermanence, philosophical truths about existence and meaning. These truths didn't require believing in literal gods, but did require taking the mythology seriously as profound human creation. As we near the end of this long journey through Japanese mythology, it's worth pausing to consider what these stories reveal about the enduring human challenges they address. Strip away the specific cultural context, the Japanese islands, the imperial line, the particular gods with their particular names, and what remains are questions every human culture must answer somehow. The mythology begins with the most fundamental question: why is there something rather than nothing? The answer, primordial chaos gradually organizing itself through spontaneous generation of increasingly complex deities, reflects a worldview profoundly different from monotheistic creation. There's no omnipotent creator standing outside reality and willing it into being. Instead, consciousness and form emerge from within existence itself, gradually, through successive generations. This cosmogony suggests that order isn't imposed from outside but develops organically from chaos. The implication for human life is significant. We aren't executing a divine plan created by transcendent intelligence. We're participating in reality's ongoing self-organization, continuing the work the primordial gods began when they stirred the ocean and formed the first islands. The prominence of purification rituals throughout the mythology, Izanagi washing after returning from Yomi, the elaborate ceremonies removing pollution from the celestial plane after Susanoo's destructiveness, the ongoing practices at shrines and in daily life, reflects a worldview where purity and pollution are real forces requiring management. This isn't primarily about moral guilt, though Buddhist influence later introduced that dimension. It's about maintaining boundaries, ensuring proper order, preventing chaos from reclaiming what has been organized. In psychological terms, purification rituals acknowledge that we accumulate psychic pollution through existence, trauma, grief, moral compromise, exposure to death and decay. We need practices that symbolically wash away these accumulations, allowing fresh engagement with life. The mythology suggests this isn't weakness or superstition, but recognition of genuine need. The repeated pattern of forbidden glimpses, Izanagi looking at Izanami in Yomi, Hori seeing Toyota Mahime's dragon form, encodes wisdom about boundaries and trust. Some things cannot be seen without consequences. Some transformations require privacy. Curiosity, however natural, can destroy relationships by violating necessary boundaries. This pattern appears across mythologies worldwide, suggesting it touches something universal about human psychology. We are curious creatures. We want to know, but some knowledge comes at unacceptable cost. Learning to live with mystery, to accept that some things must remain unseen, represents maturity. The mythology teaches this not through abstract principle, but through tragic stories showing what happens when the prohibition is violated. The relationship between Amaterasu and Susanoo, order and chaos, sun and storm, suggests that both are necessary. Pure order becomes rigid and lifeless. Pure chaos destroys everything. The cosmos requires both. Amaterasu's stability and predictability enabling agriculture and civilization, Susanoo's wildness representing possibility, transformation, the creative destruction that clears away the old to make space for new growth. Their conflict and eventual reconciliation models how order and chaos must negotiate rather than one simply defeating the other. Susanoo isn't destroyed or permanently exiled. He's civilized through marriage and redirected toward heroic rather than destructive expression. But he remains himself, still wild, still excessive, still operating outside normal boundaries. The wisdom lies in channeling rather than eliminating chaos. The mythology's treatment of death, Izanami's transformation into the queen of the dead, the sealing of Yomi, the ongoing pollution death creates, reflects awareness that mortality defines human existence. Death isn't punishment for sin or unfortunate accident, it's built into reality's structure from the beginning. Izanami's death establishing mortality means that even divine beings experience limitation, loss, ending. But the mythology doesn't treat death as absolute ending. Ancestors remain present, requiring honor and offering protection. The boundary between living and dead isn't impermeable. It can be crossed, though doing so carries risk and requires proper ritual. This suggests a worldview where death transforms rather than annihilates, where the dead remain part of the community though in different form. The gradual transition from the age of gods to the age of men, encoded in the mythology, reflects universal human experience of the sacred becoming more distant. Children experience wonder directly. Adults access it more rarely and with effort. Traditional societies maintained closer connection to the sacred. Modern life makes that connection harder. The mythology suggests this isn't decline from truth to error, but natural progression. The gods withdraw, boundaries harden, but this allows human freedom and responsibility to develop. Okunenushi's negotiated settlement with the celestial gods, retaining authority over invisible realms while ceding visible governance, offers a model for how different types of authority coexist. Political power and spiritual authority aren't identical. Whoever controls armies and administration doesn't automatically command souls and spirits. This distinction, preserved in mythological narrative, protected space for spiritual life independent of political power. The mythology's polytheism, 8 million kami rather than one god, suggests that sacred reality is irreducibly multiple. Different places, different natural forces, different aspects of experience each have their own sacred dimension, requiring specific recognition. This creates localism rather than universalism. What's sacred on this mountain differs from what's sacred in that valley. Knowledge is situated, particular, requiring attention to specific context. This epistemological stance contrasts sharply with monotheistic universalism claiming the same truth everywhere. The polytheistic worldview embedded in Japanese mythology suggests truth is plural, contextual, requiring local knowledge. The kami of your ancestors' village matter more than abstract universal principles. This can seem provincial, but it also acknowledges that universalism often means one culture's particularity claiming universal validity. The mythology's attention to agricultural cycles, rice planting ceremonies, harvest festivals, seasonal rituals, reflects the reality that human life depends on nature's rhythms. We moderns, cushioned by technology and global supply chains, easily forget this dependence. The mythology keeps the dependence front and center. The gods who ensure harvest must be honored. The cycles must be maintained. Human survival isn't guaranteed by entitlement but requires ongoing right relationship with forces beyond our control. The aesthetic sensibility throughout the mythology, appreciation for beauty and impermanence, attention to detail, finding sacred dimensions in everyday objects, suggests that spirituality isn't separate from beauty. The sacred appears through aesthetic experience, the perfect cherry blossom just before it falls, sunlight through morning mist, the weight and texture of a ritual object. This isn't decorative addition to religion, but the primary mode through which the sacred manifests. Western religious traditions often privilege verbal and conceptual dimensions, scripture, theology, correct belief. Japanese mythology suggests the sacred appears primarily through non-verbal aesthetic experience that evades conceptual capture. You don't primarily think the sacred, you see it, feel it, experience it directly through properly attuned senses. The mythology's embrace of contradiction, gods who are both creative and destructive, beneficial and dangerous, local and universal, reflects comfort with paradox that Western logic often resists. Kami aren't morally pure beings to emulate. They're powerful forces to respect, capable of blessing or curse depending on circumstances and treatment. This complexity makes them feel more real than purely good or evil abstractions. Human nature appears similarly complex in the mythology. Heroes like Akunanushi succeed through combination of cleverness, persistence, divine assistance, and luck, not through superior virtue or strength alone. Villains like the 80 Brothers aren't pure evil, but jealous, cruel, short-sighted humans whose failures lead to deserved punishment. The mythology doesn't divide reality into absolute good versus absolute evil, but shows a moral landscape of greys requiring navigation. Perhaps most profoundly, Japanese mythology suggests that meaning comes through participation rather than understanding. You don't need correct beliefs about Amaterasu to experience her blessings through ritual. You don't have to solve theological puzzles or pass doctrinal tests. You participate in seasonal festivals, make offerings at shrines, observe taboos about pollution and purification, honor your ancestors. Orthopraxy matters more than orthodoxy, right action rather than right belief. This emphasis on participation over belief creates different dynamics than belief-centered religions. You can doubt or question while still participating. The practices carry their own meaning, independent of what you consciously think about them. This allows multiple levels of engagement. The child participating unreflectively, the adult reflecting on meanings while still doing the practices, the scholar analyzing while also respecting. The mythology ultimately offers a framework for being at home in the world, specifically the Japanese archipelago, but by extension any place. It teaches attention to the particularity of location, respect for the specific forces active in your environment, practices for maintaining right relationship with what exceeds human control. It provides stories that make sense of suffering, loss, change, and death without promising to eliminate them. These patterns and meanings transcend their specific cultural origins. The mythology's insights about purity and pollution, order and chaos, visible and invisible authority, the relationship between humans and nature, these speak to universal human concerns even though articulated through specifically Japanese stories. This is why the mythology continues generating meaning long after its original cosmological claims lost authority. We've travelled a long road together tonight, from the primordial ocean churned by a jeweled spear, to the postmodern world where kami appear in video games and ecological movements cite Shinto principles. From Izanagi and Izanami forming the first islands, to contemporary scholars debating what the mythology means in a globalized secular age. From the age of gods when deities walked the earth to the present moment when those deities are remembered, reimagined, reinterpreted endlessly. The journey reflects the trajectory the mythology itself describes. From undifferentiated chaos to increasing complexity and definition, through a golden age of perfect order, into decline and fragmentation, and finally dispersal into myriad forms. The mythology's story has become its own story. It has lived out the pattern it describes. What began as cosmological explanation, why these islands exist, why the sun rises, why humans die, became political ideology legitimizing imperial rule. That ideology was weaponized to justify imperialism and war, then collapsed spectacularly when the emperor renounced divinity. But the mythology didn't disappear. It transformed into cultural resource, aesthetic vocabulary, source for contemporary creativity, framework for thinking about ecology, and community and meaning. This transformation mirrors what happens in individual lives. The stories our families tell us begin as simple truth. This is how things are. Gradually we recognize their constructed nature, their embellishment, their service to particular agendas. We might reject them entirely, seeing only manipulation and error, but often with more maturity we return to them differently, not as literal truth, but as resource for understanding where we came from, what shaped us, how to make sense of our present. Japanese mythology has reached this mature stage. It's no longer innocent cosmology unaware of its constructed nature. It's not rigid orthodoxy demanding belief. It's tradition aware of itself as tradition, capable of self-reflection, available for creative reinterpretation while still maintaining continuity with its origins. The East Shrine, rebuilt every 20 years using ancient techniques, embodies this perfectly. It's simultaneously ancient and new. The design is millennia old, but the structure is barely 20 years old at any given moment. This paradox resolves through understanding that what's transmitted isn't the physical structure, but the knowledge, skill, and intention required to build it. Similarly, the mythology persists not as frozen text, but as living tradition, constantly dying and being reborn, remaining recognizably itself while never being exactly the same. As you return now to your own life, whether it's late evening where you are, or early morning, or some other hour, you carry with you traces of this journey. You've met Amaterasu and Susanoo, watched Izanagi flee the underworld, witnessed Okunanushi taming the land, followed the Imperial line from divine descent through 1,000 years of political fiction to post-war transformation. What will you do with these stories? Perhaps nothing. They've been entertainment, a way to pass time, something to listen to while doing other things. That's fine. Stories don't require productive use to justify their existence. But perhaps something lingers. An image, a question, a different way of seeing. Perhaps next time you encounter a shrine, whether in Japan or a Japanese community abroad, you'll see it differently, aware of the layers of meaning and history it carries. Perhaps you'll notice your own culture's creation myths with fresh eyes, recognizing patterns Japanese mythology illuminated. Perhaps the concept of kami, sacred presence in particular places, will shift how you experience mountains, rivers, or ancient trees. The mythology teaches that beginnings matter. How we tell the story of origin shapes everything that follows. Japan told itself a story about divine islands and imperial descent, and that story shapes centuries of history, for better and worse. What stories do we tell ourselves? What origins do we claim? How do those narratives empower or constrain us? The mythology also teaches that even gods make mistakes. Izanagi looked when he shouldn't have. Amaterasu hid in a cave. Susanoo destroyed his sister's rice paddies. The deities aren't perfect beings to emulate, but powerful forces making their way through existence, sometimes succeeding, often failing. There's compassion in this. If gods struggle and err, we shouldn't expect perfection from ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, the mythology demonstrates that endings are transformations rather than annihilations. The age of gods didn't cease to exist when it ended. It became the foundation for what followed. Izanami's death didn't make her meaningless, but transformed her into the queen of the underworld. The mythology's loss of cosmological authority didn't render it worthless, but freed it to become many things instead of one thing. We live in a time when many traditional frameworks are losing their authority. Religious certainty is questioned, political systems failing, environmental catastrophe looming, technological change accelerating beyond our ability to process meaningfully. The Japanese mythology's journey from confident cosmological explanation to fragmented but still vital cultural resource offers a model for how traditions survive their own transformation. They survive by releasing claims to exclusive truth while maintaining their capacity to generate meaning, by becoming available for creative reinterpretation rather than demanding unchanged preservation, by acknowledging their constructed nature without succumbing to cynicism that nothing matters, by serving particular communities while remaining open to others engaging differently, by dying and being reborn continuously, like a shrine's 20-year cycle. Outside your window, whether it's dark or light, the world continues its ancient patterns. The sun will rise tomorrow, not because Amaterasu commands it, but because of physics and planetary motion. Yet describing sunrise purely mechanistically loses something. The mythology suggests there are other ways of seeing. The sun as sacred gift rather than automatic occurrence, dawn as renewal rather than mere continuation, light as blessing, requiring gratitude rather than entitlement. These ways of seeing don't require rejecting scientific understanding. They complement it, adding dimensions that physics can't capture, meaning value, sacred quality, the sense that existence is gift rather than accident. The mythology offers these ways of seeing not as replacement for modernity, but as resources we can draw on while remaining fully contemporary. So perhaps that's what remains most valuable from this long exploration. Not specific beliefs about gods and emperors, but practices of attention, frameworks for reverence, stories that make the ordinary world strange and the strange world meaningful. The mythology invites us to see sacred presence in particular places, to honor ancestors and attend to cycles, to practice purification and renewal. to make beauty an acknowledgement of impermanence. These practices don't solve our problems, they don't answer our questions, but they provide ways of being in the world that acknowledge mystery, cultivate reverence, and maintain connection to what exceeds individual understanding. In a time of isolation, environmental crisis, and meaning vacuum, such practices may matter more than cosmological certainty ever did. The mythology began with chaos and organization, with gods stirring the ocean and creating islands. It ends, but doesn't end, with you, here, now, carrying forward the story simply by knowing it. You've become part of the mythology's latest transformation, another person through whom these ancient stories continue their strange journey through time. The kami, if they exist, don't demand your belief, but they invite your attention. The stories, whether true or not, offer their gifts. The tradition, neither dead nor unchanging, makes itself available for your engagement however you choose to offer it. As always, I'm grateful you've shared this journey. Wherever you are, I hope you find rest tonight, and that the stories accompany your dreams gently. The islands remain, floating in their sea, the sun will rise again, and the myths, changed, contested, reimagined endlessly, continue their work of making meaning from the raw material of existence. Thank you for listening. May you walk in beauty, whatever paths you take from here.